If you've ever looked at a map of the world and wondered why people from different places look so different, move through heat and cold so differently, digest different foods, resist different diseases, you're not alone. That question has fascinated scientists for centuries, and it turns out the answer is one of the most compelling stories in all of human history. We are one species. Every person alive today traces their ancestry back to the same small population in Africa. Same origin, same basic biology, same fundamental blueprint. And yet, over tens of thousands of years, human populations living in different corners of the world developed striking differences. Lighter skin in the north, darker in the tropics. Bodies shaped differently for heat versus cold. Enzymes tuned to different diets. Immune systems carrying the fingerprints of different diseases. Why? Here's what this is not about. This is not a story about superiority or hierarchy. Evolution doesn't work that way. No adaptation is better in any absolute sense. Lighter skin isn't better than darker skin. It's a response to a specific problem in a specific place at a specific time. That's the whole point. Every difference we're going to talk about tonight is a solution, not a ranking. What this is a detective story, one that moves across continents and climate zones, through ice ages and migrations and plagues and famines. The real reasons Europeans and Africans evolved differently come down to a handful of powerful forces: climate and ultraviolet radiation shaping the skin, food environments selecting for different digestive abilities, disease landscapes driving immune variation, waves of migration mixing populations together and then pulling them apart again. And woven through all of it, culture, because the things humans do, how they farm, how they herd animals, how they cook food, change the selection pressures acting on their own genes. Biology and behavior pulling on each other across thousands of generations. We're going to move through all of it, slowly and carefully, because this story deserves that treatment. And if you're listening to this to wind down, to let the day go quiet around you, that's exactly what this is made for. A calm pace, a clear thread, something genuinely worth following even as your eyes get heavy. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read them, and it never stops being remarkable. Someone in Lagos at midnight. Someone in Helsinki just before dawn. Someone in Toronto who can't sleep on a Tuesday. All of you, same species, same curiosity, wildly different corners of the world. Which is honestly a perfect place to start this conversation. And if you want to support this channel in the simplest way possible, follow on Spotify and listen there. The link is in the description. It genuinely helps more than most people realise. Now, back to the question, one species, one origin point. And then, starting roughly 60 to 70,000 years ago, people began moving. Out of Africa and into environments that had never seen a modern human before. Searing deserts, ice-covered plains, dense rainforests, high mountain plateaus. Each of those environments had its own demands, and over generations those demands left marks in the genome, in the body, in the way populations live and thrive and survive. That's where this story begins. Start with Africa. Always start with Africa, because that's where the evidence points, clearly and consistently. Every genetic analysis, every fossil record, every ancient DNA study converges on the same conclusion. Homo sapiens evolved on the African continent. Not partially, not with a little help from other places. Entirely, fundamentally, originally African. The oldest modern human fossils we have come from sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, dated to around 300,000 years ago, and from sites in East Africa not far behind. The oldest continuous genetic lineages on Earth belong to populations still living in Africa today. The San people of southern Africa, certain groups in Ethiopia and Cameroon, they carry within their DNA the deepest roots of the human family tree. When geneticists map the variation in human genomes and trace it back through time, the branches all converge in Africa. That's where the trunk is. That's where everything began. So when we talk about Europeans and Africans evolving differently, we need to be precise about what that sentence actually means, because it's easy to hear it the wrong way. It does not mean that two separate lineages developed in isolation and ended up as fundamentally different kinds of people. It does not mean that one group is more evolved or more adapted or further along some imaginary scale of biological progress. Those framings are not just wrong scientifically, they're the opposite of what the evidence shows. What it means is this. After modern humans spent hundreds of thousands of years in Africa, small groups eventually began moving into new environments. And in those new environments, different pressures, different climates, different diets, different diseases, they nudged populations in different directions. Not all at once, not dramatically, but over thousands of generations, certain traits became more common in certain places because they helped people survive and reproduce in those specific conditions. That's what evolve differently means, local fine-tuning on a shared foundation. The technical term geneticists use is allele frequency. Every human carries 2 copies of almost every gene, and most genes come in slightly different versions called alleles. The difference between populations isn't usually that one group has a gene and another doesn't. It's that certain versions of a gene are more common here than there. You might carry an allele at 5% frequency in one population and 30% in another. That shift in frequency, driven by selection or chance or the movement of people, is what we're actually talking about when we say populations evolve differently. And here's what's crucial. The variation between human populations is surprisingly small. Geneticists have known for decades that something like 85 to 90% of all genetic variation in our species exists within populations, not between them. Meaning 2 people from the same village in Nigeria can be more genetically different from each other than either of them is from someone in Sweden. We are, as a species, remarkably similar. The differences are real, they matter, they have stories worth telling. But they sit on top of a shared genetic inheritance, so deep and so extensive that the word different only makes sense in the most specific, qualified, careful way. That shared inheritance is the product of where we came from. That same ancestral African population now. This is also the moment to distinguish between 3 things that often get tangled together in these conversations: ancestry, population history, and race. Ancestry is biological. It's about which populations your genetic material descends from, and it's measurable. Genetic testing can identify ancestry because different populations over time accumulated slightly different patterns of variation that serve as statistical fingerprints. Population history is the story of how those patterns got there. Migration, isolation, interbreeding, bottlenecks, selection, the forces that shaped who ended up where with what genome. That's what most of this conversation is about. Race is something else entirely. Racial categories are social and political constructs. They were invented by humans to organize societies, usually in contexts of power and hierarchy, and they map only loosely onto genetic reality. The racial categories that most people recognize, black, white, Asian, and so on, don't correspond to clean genetic clusters. They blur, they overlap, they miss enormous internal diversity. The continent of Africa alone contains more genetic variation than the rest of the world combined. Any system that treats Africa as a single racial category is erasing more diversity than it captures. This isn't political opinion, it's what the data shows. And it matters, because when we talk about why certain traits are more common in certain populations, we're talking about specific populations in specific places under specific pressures, not about broad racial categories with sharp boundaries. So what are the actual mechanisms that created the differences we're going to explore tonight? There are four main ones, and they work together. The first is natural selection. When an environment consistently rewards a certain trait, individuals who carry it tend to survive and reproduce more successfully. Over generations, the alleles linked to that trait become more common in the population. Skin pigmentation is the most visible example, and we'll spend real time on it later. The second is genetic drift, random chance. When a small group splits off from a larger population and founds a new one, they carry only a subset of the original genetic variation. Some alleles just happen to be more common in that small founding group, and those frequencies get passed down through the generations that follow. It's not selection, it's luck, but it shapes populations just as surely. The third is the founder effect, which is really a specific and dramatic version of drift, when a very small group moves into a new territory and becomes the ancestors of a much larger population. Their particular combination of alleles echoes through all the descendants. We'll see this again and again in the story of human dispersal. The fourth is gene flow, the movement of people, and therefore genes between populations. Populations are never perfectly sealed. People marry across group lines. Migrations bring new alleles into existing communities. Ancient DNA research has shown that what looks like a stable, isolated population on the surface often turns out to be the product of multiple waves of mixture from very different source populations. Selection, drift, founder effects, gene flow. These are the tools that worked on a shared human genome across tens of thousands of years in dozens of environments and produced the variation we see today. None of it is a ranking, all of it is a story, and the story starts in Africa, with a species that was already ancient and already diverse before it ever set foot anywhere else. Before anyone walked out of Africa, long before there were people calling themselves anything like European or African, the continent was already a patchwork of human worlds. Geneticists sometimes say Africa doesn't just contain the roots of the human family tree. It contains many of the thickest branches as well. When you compare genomes from around the world, you see a striking pattern. Populations outside Africa tend to look like subsets of the variation you find within Africa, as if someone took a huge library, grabbed a handful of books, and built a smaller library somewhere else. Those smaller libraries can be interesting and unique, but the full catalogue, the deepest time depth, is still at the source. There are two main reasons for that: time and structure. Time first. Modern humans evolved in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. The earliest dispersals of our species out of Africa that left lasting descendants are on the order of 60 to 70,000 years ago. That means that for at least 200,000 years before those major dispersals, all of our direct ancestors were living somewhere on the African continent. Generation after generation, mutation after mutation, small differences accumulated in different lineages. Most of those differences are neutral, with no obvious effect. But they're still there, tiny genetic footprints of deep history. Then there's structure. Those ancestors weren't all living in one big panmictic population, randomly mating with everyone else. Africa is huge. Even today, if you travel from the forests of the Congo Basin to the highlands of Ethiopia, from the Atlantic coast of West Africa to the savannas of Kenya, you cross environments that look, feel, and behave like different planets. It was the same in the deep past, and climate swings made it even more dramatic. Think about the ecologies laid out across that continent. Dense equatorial rainforests, dark and humid, where sunlight filters through thick canopies and sound carries strangely. Open savannas and grasslands where visibility is long. Predators are many, and waterholes are lifelines. Vast deserts and semi-deserts, like the Sahara and the Namib, shifting in size over time, sometimes barriers, sometimes corridors. Highland plateaus in Ethiopia and East Africa, where cooler temperatures, thinner air, and rugged terrain shape life in their own way. River systems like the Nile, the Niger, the Zambezi, threading through all of it. Each of those environments imposed different pressures on the groups of early humans living there. In the forests, navigation and foraging might have favoured spatial memory and intimate plant knowledge. On the savannas, tracking animals over long distances, reading subtle signs in the grass and dust, might have been paramount. In semi-arid regions, anticipating rains, locating hidden water, coping with scorching heat and cold nights all mattered. In highlands, oxygen levels and temperature shifts created their own challenges. Now layer climate change on top of that. Over the last few 100,000 years, Africa went through repeated wet phases and dry phases. Rain belts moved north and south. The Sahara flipped between green, with lakes and rivers, and hyper-arid, almost empty of life. Forests expanded and contracted, savannas opened up or closed down. When conditions were good, populations could expand and connect with neighbours. When things turned bad, groups were pushed into refuges, pockets of survivable habitat where they could hang on until the climate eased. The result wasn't one ancestral population, but many semi-isolated ones. Little networks in West Africa, others in East Africa, others in the south, the centre, the north, sometimes connected by gene flow, sometimes cut off for long stretches. People moving along rivers, along coastlines, through mountain passes, across temporarily green Saharan corridors, then being cut off again when the environment shifted. Geneticists see traces of this in patterns they call deep population structure. When they model African ancestry tens or hundreds of thousands of years back, they don't get a single neat lineage. They get hints of long separated branches that occasionally come back into contact and mix. Ancient DNA from a child buried in what is now Ethiopia, from hunter-gatherers in Malawi, from ancient North Africans, all point to the same thing, a continent where human groups were diverging, reconnecting, and diverging again over vast stretches of time. But the evidence is messy. Fossils, stone tools, and genetics don't always line up in a simple way. A skull that looks very modern can turn up in a place and time where the genetics, if we could see them, might still be quite distinct from present-day groups. Stone tool traditions can spread between cultures through imitation and trade without massive movement of people. Genetics can show continuity where the fossils are sparse, or disruption where the tools look stable. Each line of evidence tells part of the story, but none of them gives a complete script on its own. This is why anthropologists now talk about African origins in the plural. Not one Garden of Eden, but a network of populations across multiple regions. Eastern savannas, southern coasts, central forests, northern grasslands, all contributing threads to what would eventually become Homo sapiens as we recognize it today. Some models even suggest that traits we now call modern human assembled gradually in different places and then spread through interbreeding and cultural contact, rather than appearing all at once in a single lucky group. And this is also why the simple contrast Africa versus Europe doesn't really make sense, biologically or historically. Before any humans set foot in Europe, Africa already contained more internal diversity than Europe would ever hold. When small bands finally left the continent, they carried with them only a fraction of that variation, plus whatever new changes would accumulate in their new homes. Europe is one set of branches that grew out of an already branching African tree. So when we talk about Europeans evolving under certain pressures, we're always talking about a subset of a much older, more diverse African story. The relevant comparison isn't Europeans versus Africans, as if those were two uniform blocks. It's one particular stream of African-descended populations that moved into Eurasia, compared to multiple streams that stayed, mixed and continued evolving inside Africa itself. To understand what happened after humans left, we have to keep this in mind. The people who walked out of Africa were not representatives of a single homogeneous continent. They were just one slice of a deep, structured, and already ancient diversity. And that starting point shaped everything that followed, from founder effects and bottlenecks to the specific ways different regions of the world ended up evolving on top of the same shared human foundation. When people finally began leaving Africa in ways that would leave a lasting mark on today's populations, it didn't happen in one dramatic exodus, like a single caravan marching over a hill and never looking back. It happened in windows, pulses, opportunities opened by climate, closed by climate, and sometimes reopened tens of thousands of years later. The first thing to understand is that out of Africa isn't one event. There were early forays, probably more than one, where small groups of anatomically modern humans reached parts of the Levant and maybe Arabia as far back as 100 to 120,000 years ago. Fossils from places like Skul and Kafse in what is now Israel hint at these early expansions. But those early branches seem to have been cut off. Climate shifted, habitats contracted, Neanderthal populations expanded back into some of those same regions. The descendants of those first modern humans, as far as we can tell from present-day genetics, did not become the main ancestors of later Eurasians. They were experiments that didn't leave many surviving lines. The major dispersal that shows up in the DNA of most people outside Africa today seems to come from a later wave, around 60 to 70,000 years ago. Sea levels were lower, parts of the Red Sea and the southern Arabian coast were more passable. There are two main route ideas, a northern corridor through the Sinai and Levant, and a southern route across the Bab el-Mandeb straight into Arabia and along the coasts of the Indian Ocean. It might not have been either or. Different groups at different times could have used both. What matters for our story is that only a subset of the African diversity made it through those gateways. Not because they were the best, not because they were chosen, but because of geography, timing, and sheer luck. This is where founder effects come in. Imagine again that vast African library of genetic diversity. Thousands of books, millions of tiny variations. Now imagine that the group that leaves is not the whole library. It's one research team that grabs a few shelves worth of volumes and sets up a new archive overseas. All the future copies in that new archive will be made from that limited set of books. They can write new marginal notes, a few new pages over time, but they can't suddenly access all the missing volumes left behind in Africa. A founder effect is that process in genetic terms. A small group breaks off from a larger, more diverse population and starts a new population somewhere else. Just by chance, that small group may carry certain genetic variants at higher or lower frequencies than in the original population. Some variants may be missing entirely. Crucially, this can change the genetic landscape even if natural selection isn't pushing for any particular trait. Roll a small handful of dice, and the outcome can be very different from the smooth average of 1,000 rolls. If a random handful of your ancestors happen to have more of one trait, say a particular immune system variant or a certain hair texture, those traits might become common in their descendants, not because they were better, but because that's who happened to walk away. The main out-of-Africa dispersal seems to have involved a relatively small effective population size. Geneticists can infer this by looking at how much variation is present and how it's arranged along the genome. Outside Africa, the signal is clear. Fewer variants overall, more signs of recent shared ancestry, and stronger imprints of past bottlenecks. A bottleneck is like an extreme founder effect. Instead of just a small group peeling off once, the entire population goes through a sharp reduction in numbers, then regrows. We've already seen this on a massive scale in the deep past, during that 117,000-year crisis. But smaller, more regional bottlenecks happened later too, as groups moved through harsh environments, crossed ecological barriers, or got trapped in refuges during cold phases of the Ice Age. Now add another layer, serial founder effects. The people who left Africa didn't leapfrog directly to France, China, and Australia. They moved in steps. A group settles in Arabia. Then a portion of that group moves on to South Asia. From there, another portion continues to Southeast Asia, and another branch moves north towards Central Asia and Europe. Each step can involve its own founder effect, a subset of a subset of a subset. With every new frontier, the genetic deck gets reshuffled from a smaller starting hand. Some lineages get left behind at earlier stages, others drift to high frequency further along a route. Over thousands of years, this process creates a gradient. The further you get from the original source, the less of the original diversity you see, and the more the local frequencies of traits have wandered just by chance. Geneticists call one consequence of this isolation by distance. It's a simple idea. If people mostly mate with their neighbours, and neighbours are spread across a large landscape, then genetic differences accumulate gradually with geographic distance. You don't need sharp borders or big racial divisions to get patterns. You just need many generations of local marriages, small migrations, and occasional bottlenecks. Europe's later distinctiveness sits on top of this history. By the time human groups were establishing themselves in what would one day be called Europe, they were already the products of serial founder events from Africa through the Near East and Western Asia. They carried only a subset of African variation to begin with. Then they went through their own episodes of isolation in glacial refuges, local expansions, and population crashes during Ice Age swings. This means that some of the genetic differences we see today between Europeans and many Africans are not the product of dramatic directional selection for European traits versus African traits, at least not initially. They're partly the result of who happened to be in the small groups that moved out, who survived the bottlenecks along the way, and how those lineages drifted in frequency in scattered, semi-isolated populations over tens of thousands of years. Later, natural selection would indeed act on this uneven starting palette, especially under Europe's extreme and rapidly changing climates. But it was the founder effects and serial dispersals out of a structured African homeland that set the initial conditions. The dice had already been rolled before ice sheets advanced over northern plains, before farming spread, before cities rose. To understand why Europeans and many African populations ended up looking and, in some respects, functioning differently, we have to keep both pieces in view, the deep African diversity that provided the raw material and the narrow contingent channels through which only some of that diversity flowed into Eurasia. The next part of the story unfolds on a continent where climate behaved like a yo-yo, pushing those Eurasian descendants through yet more cycles of contraction, expansion, and change. Europe, during the time our species moved into it, was not the calm backdrop we tend to imagine when we picture prehistory. It wasn't an endless green forest with gentle seasons and predictable hunts. It was a continent on a climate rollercoaster, lurching between extremes over and over again. For the last couple of million years, Earth's climate has been dominated by glacial cycles. Ice ages in, ice ages out, on, off, like a very slow, very destructive light switch. During glacial maxima, huge ice sheets spread out from Scandinavia and the Alps, grinding down mountains, pushing south across the plains, locking up so much water that sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters. When ice advanced, northern Europe didn't just get colder. In many places it stopped being habitable at all. Think tundra pushed south, forests disappearing, grasslands turning into steppe, and then even those open landscapes giving way to near-polar deserts of wind and dust. Herds of cold-adapted animals roamed, but overall biomass dropped. Growing seasons shrank. The margin for human survival narrowed to a knife's edge. Then, as orbital cycles shifted, the ice would retreat again. Slowly at first, then in pulses. Forests crept back north, rivers found new courses, coastlines flooded. What had been an icy wasteland might, a few thousand years later, be dense woodland full of game and edible plants. Habitats didn't just slide smoothly from one state to another, they tore, fragmented, reassembled. For human beings, this meant Europe never really settled down. Groups that had pushed north during a warm phase could find themselves squeezed out or exterminated when conditions turned. Populations that were widespread during one interglacial might be shoved into a few scattered pockets of survivable habitat during the next big freeze. These pockets are what scientists call refugia. When the ice sheets reached their maximum extent, most of northern and central Europe became marginal at best. But parts of southern Europe stayed comparatively mild, still cold by tropical standards, but not utterly deadly. The Iberian Peninsula, Italy, the Balkans, bits of the French southwest, coastal refuges along the Mediterranean. These areas acted like emergency shelters during the worst glacial phases. Human groups retreated into these refugia, along with many plants and animals. Lineages that had once been spread across half a continent suddenly found themselves compressed into narrow strips of land, mountain valleys and sheltered coasts. Populations shrank, contact between pockets became more difficult. Rivers froze or changed course. Glaciers and barren steppe lay between groups that had once traded and intermarried. This is where that genetic history we talked about becomes crucial again. When a population is forced into a refuge and reduced in size, you get another bottleneck. Some lineages disappear just by bad luck. Others become common simply because their carriers happen to be in the right place at the right time. Over thousands of years stuck in a refuge, genetic drift can reshape the frequencies of traits in powerful ways, even without strong selection. Then the climate eases, the ice pulls back. Suddenly, those small refuge populations are sitting at the edge of a newly opening continent. Forests are advancing northwards, rivers thawing, game spreading into fresh territory. And the humans follow. Rapid re-expansions from these refugia repopulate Europe, each expansion wave carrying the genetic imprint of its particular shelter. But the climate doesn't stop changing. Another cold phase comes. Populations contract again, maybe into the same refugia, maybe into slightly different ones. Some groups vanish, others survive and seed the next re-expansion. It's like repeatedly squeezing a sponge and letting it soak up water again. Only each squeeze changes the pattern of pores inside. Over multiple glacial cycles, this repeated pattern, contraction into southern refuges, local drift and adaptation, then expansion northward again, amplified differences between regions and lineages. Groups isolated in Iberia during one cold phase might drift in one direction genetically and culturally. Groups tucked into the Balkans might drift in another. When the ice withdrew, their descendants fanned out across overlapping territories, mixing in some cases, staying distinct in others. On top of this demographic shuffling, there were the direct demands of life in a highly seasonal, often brutally cold environment. Even in the milder Refugia, seasons in Pleistocene Europe were sharper than in many tropical and subtropical parts of Africa. Long, dark winters, short growing seasons, huge swings in temperature and food availability from one part of the year to the next. In the north and at higher elevations, this seasonality became extreme. Surviving meant not just enduring cold snaps, but getting through months where plants barely grew and large animals migrated or died off. Selection may have favoured traits that helped people cope with this kind of stress. Better thermal regulation, body shapes that retained heat more efficiently, metabolic tweaks for dealing with long periods of low-calorie intake, behaviour patterns geared toward hoarding and planning for lean months. It likely favoured cultural solutions even more strongly. Better shelters, tailored clothing, food storage, cooperative hunting strategies that could handle seasonal migrations. How much of this left a clear genetic imprint is still debated. Some proposed cold adaptation genes in Europeans and other northerly populations are plausible, but in many cases scientists can't yet say whether those variants were directly selected for cold, for diet, for disease resistance, or for some combination. What is clearer is that the repeated exposure to intense seasonality and cold stress created a very different selection landscape from that experienced by many populations in Africa. And that contrast matters. Africa was not a stable paradise. Far from it. Rainfall belts shifted, deserts expanded and shrank, forests grew and retreated, coastlines moved. The Sahara in particular turned from green savanna to harsh desert and back multiple times, acting as both a bridge and a barrier between different African regions. East Africa saw dramatic swings in lakes and resources. Southern Africa went through its own climatic ups and downs. But the pattern was not simply on-off ice coverage over an entire subcontinent. Large parts of Africa, especially nearer the equator, remained free of ice sheets altogether. Even when climates became drier or wetter, many regions kept some degree of ecological continuity: wooded savannas, mixed mosaics of forest and grassland, coastlines with marine resources. People could move, track rainfall, follow rivers, and shift their ranges without always being trapped in tiny peninsulas of habitability. This meant that although African populations certainly experienced bottlenecks and local refuges, the whole landscape wasn't repeatedly bulldozed by advancing glaciers in the same way. There were more continuous corridors for gene flow, more overlapping ranges, more room for populations to expand and contract without being squeezed into very narrow, isolated shelters as often. In Europe, by contrast, the geography of peninsulas and mountain ranges funneled people into specific safe zones again and again, then launched them back out. That rhythm of forced isolation and sudden expansion magnified genetic drift, encouraged local adaptation to sharply seasonal and cold conditions, and created strong regional signatures in the descendants who would later be called European. By the time the last major ice sheets melted back in the Holocene, the relatively warm period we live in now began about 11,700 years ago. Europe's human populations had been through multiple rounds of this climate roller coaster. Their gene pools already carried the marks of founder effects from Africa, serial bottlenecks along the migration routes, and then these repeated contractions and re-expansions inside Europe itself. Those marks would shape how later evolutionary pressures played out. Pressures from sunlight, vitamin balance, diet, and disease. To see why traits like skin colour shifted in different ways in Europe and across Africa, we have to place them against this backdrop of wildly different climate histories on the two continents. That story starts with the sun. The sun is not just light and warmth in this story. It's a chemical force, a stream of radiation that quietly writes itself into biology. For humans, the crucial part of that stream is ultraviolet, UV radiation. Too little and you have one set of problems. Too much and you have another. Our ancestors' skin sat right at the centre of that trade-off. The first piece of that puzzle is something most people never think about: folate. Folate is a B vitamin, a small molecule with outsized importance. Your body uses it to build DNA, to make red blood cells, to help embryos develop properly. If folate levels crash during pregnancy, the risks of severe birth defects go up. If folate drops in adults, you can see problems with fertility, anemia, even issues in sperm production. Here's where the sun comes in. High energy UV, especially UVB, and parts of UVA, can break down folate circulating in blood vessels near the surface of the skin. The more your skin is exposed to intense year-round sunlight, the more of your folate is at risk of being degraded. Over many generations in places with blazing UV, this becomes more than just a nuisance. It's a threat to reproductive success. Natural selection notices threats like that. Melanin, the pigment that darkens skin, acts like a biological sunscreen. It absorbs and scatters UV before it can penetrate deeper tissues. Darker skin isn't just a colour, it's a protective layer that helps shield folate in the bloodstream from being destroyed by sunlight. In equatorial Africa, where UV levels are high and fairly constant through the year, this protection matters, especially for populations living largely outdoors with minimal clothing year after year, generation after generation. Individuals whose skin allowed too much UV penetration risked folate loss, higher rates of birth defects, reduced fertility. Those with more melanin had a better chance of having healthy offspring who survived and reproduced. Over long spans of time, that pressure likely favoured darker pigmentation in many ancestral African populations. Not because of some aesthetic preference, not because of moral or intellectual differences, but because molecules of folate needed shelter from the relentless UV of the tropical sun. But folate is only half the equation. The same UVB radiation that destroys folate also does something essential. It helps your skin make vitamin D. Vitamin D is not really a vitamin in the usual sense. It's more like a hormone precursor. Your body uses UVB to convert a cholesterol-related compound in the skin into a substance that will eventually become active vitamin D. Without enough of it, calcium metabolism goes sideways. Bones don't mineralize properly. In children, severe deficiency can cause rickets, soft, deformed bones. In adults, pain, fractures, immune issues. So evolution is juggling two opposing demands. Protect folate from UV damage. Let enough UV through to synthesize adequate vitamin D. Near the equator, where UV is abundant, this balance is easier for darkly pigmented skin to manage. There's so much UV that even with a strong melanin shield, enough gets through on a regular basis to make vitamin D, especially for people spending long hours outside. The bigger danger is folate destruction, heat stress, skin damage. So melanin levels tend to ratchet up, move far from the equator, and the calculus changes. In high latitudes, especially during long winters, UVB levels drop dramatically. The sun is lower on the horizon. Its light passes through more atmosphere, and much of the UVB is filtered out. For many months, the UV supply is meagre. Now imagine carrying very dark equatorial adapted pigmentation in such a setting without modern supplements or fortified foods. The protective shield that was so useful under tropical sun starts to become a liability. Too little UV penetrates the skin to make enough vitamin D. Children may grow with softer bones, pelvises may be narrower or more fragile, childbirth more dangerous, fractures more frequent. In that environment, individuals with slightly lighter skin, slightly less melanin, would on average be better at making vitamin D from the limited UV available. Their bones would mineralize more effectively, Their children would, on average, be healthier, more likely to survive, more likely to give birth successfully. Over many generations in low UV regions, northern Eurasia for example, this sort of pressure can nudge pigmentation lighter, not because light is inherently better, but because under those specific conditions, reduced pigmentation allows a bit more UV to seep in, tipping the balance back toward adequate vitamin D. So darker pigmentation is often adaptive where UV is intense and steady, helping to preserve folate and protect the skin itself. Lighter pigmentation can be advantageous where UV is weak and highly seasonal, improving vitamin D synthesis and bone health. The right shade is whatever best fits the local radiation landscape, given clothing, behavior, and diet. But the story is not a simple line from dark to light, equator to pole. It's a tangled web. Skin pigmentation is polygenic, controlled by many genes, each contributing a small effect. Different populations can reach similar overall shades through very different genetic routes. That's what biologists call convergent evolution. Similar solutions emerging independently in separate lineages. Some African groups in drier, higher latitude or high altitude regions have evolved lighter skin relative to equatorial neighbours, but through different combinations of variants than those common in northern Europeans. Some East Asian populations reached relatively light skin via yet another set of genetic changes. In other words, light skin in one place is not necessarily the same at the DNA level as light skin in another. And because humans are constantly moving and mixing, the boundaries blur even more. Migrations, trade, conquest, and long-distance marriages have shuffled pigmentation genes around the world. Populations in Africa include a vast range of skin tones shaped by local ecology, ancient admixture, and recent history. So do populations in Europe, South Asia, the Americas, and Oceania. There is no single African skin gene, no single European skin gene, no simple gradient marching neatly from black to white. What we see instead is a patchwork of adaptations layered over each other. UV regimes, folate protection, vitamin D requirements, cultural practices like clothing and shelter, and the random drift of genes through small isolated groups. The sun set the basic rules. Folate and vitamin D defined the trade-offs. But the ways different human groups solved that puzzle, genetically, culturally, and geographically, are far more varied than a simple map of skin colours can ever show. And that variety becomes even clearer when we look more closely at the other side of this balance. Not just how UV can destroy folate, but how life in dark, cold places turned vitamin D into a matter of survival. In the far north, winter is not just a season, it's an absence. For months on end, the sun barely clears the horizon, if it rises at all. Light is dim, UVB is almost non-existent, and the sky feels more like a ceiling than an open dome. For early humans trying to live in these latitudes, vitamin D wasn't just a biochemical detail. It was a constant constraint under those conditions. Your skin can't rely on the same easy bargain it had closer to the equator. You might go weeks, even months, with almost no UVB reaching your skin. The classic picture, bare skin in bright sun making vitamin D effortlessly, is simply wrong for a good chunk of the year. So how did people survive there at all? One answer is obvious once you think about it. Diet. Vitamin D can come from food, but only from certain kinds. Fatty fish, marine mammals, egg yolks, liver, some wild animal fats. In coastal and riverine environments rich in fish and sea life, those foods can provide a huge part of the vitamin D budget. If your ancestors lived on cold northern coasts, pulling oily fish from icy waters, cracking the bones of seals and whales, drinking broth made from heads and spines, your body could get enough vitamin D even under a weak sun. In that scenario, the selection pressure to dramatically lighten skin might be weaker. You're not relying solely on UVB anymore. You have a backup supply line coming from the ocean. This seems to be part of the story for some Arctic and subarctic peoples. Very long winters, very little UV. Yet for much of their history, relatively darker pigmentation compared with, say, Northern Europeans farther south. The diet, rich in fish, marine mammals, organ meats, fills in the vitamin D gap. Bone problems from deficiency are less likely even in a low-sun world. Now picture a different environment. You're in a high-latitude inland region. Winters are still long, and UVB is still scarce, but instead of netting fish from the sea, you're farming. Your staple foods are cereals and tubers, wheat, barley, millet, maybe later rye and oats. Good sources of calories, terrible sources of vitamin D. Meat, when you can get it, helps. But if much of your diet is grain-based, and you're bundled in clothing for most of the year, and you spend more time indoors around a hearth, sunlight can't do much for you. Under those conditions, vitamin D deficiency becomes more likely, and the consequences show up where bones and reproduction intersect. Rickets in childhood can deform the skeleton, bending legs, twisting spines, and crucially narrowing and reshaping the pelvis. In severe cases, that can turn childbirth into a life-threatening ordeal, for both mother and child. Even milder deficiencies can mean more fractures, slower healing, and potentially higher mortality in a world with no orthopedic surgery. Natural selection is sensitive to outcomes like that. Anything that improves the odds of building strong, well-mineralized bones and functional birth canals can be favored. In a cereal, heavy, low UV, heavily clothed population, lighter skin is one such change. With less melanin, the little UVB that does reach the ground, and your uncovered skin is used more efficiently. On bright days in spring and summer when people are outdoors more and sleeves are rolled up, those brief windows of exposure become vitamin D production sprints. Over many generations, this can help tilt the statistics. Fewer children born with severe rickets, fewer mothers lost in childbirth. But pigmentation is not evolving in isolation. Culture is moving too. Clothing, for example, is not just fashion. It's a filter between your skin and the sky. Furs and layered textiles that keep you from freezing also keep UV from reaching your skin. In the deep cold, you cover everything. In milder seasons, you loosen up, expose arms and faces. How people dress, how they build houses, how often they go outside. All of this changes how much selection cares about skin color as a vitamin D solution. If a group invents better shelters, spends more time indoors, and wraps more of the body year-round, the environment becomes functionally darker for the skin. That can intensify the pressure to lighten pigmentation, or if at the same time they increase consumption of fish and animal fats, the pressure might ease. Cultural choices don't just respond to biology, they reshape the playing field on which biological evolution happens. This is what researchers mean by gene culture feedback. A cultural practice appears, maybe a shift in diet like farming cereals. That practice creates new nutritional constraints, such as less vitamin D in daily food. Those constraints change which genetic variants are favored in this case, alleles that lighten skin or tweak vitamin D metabolism. As those genes spread, they can, in turn, make certain cultural strategies more viable. A population with more efficient vitamin D synthesis might be able to lean harder on cereal agriculture in a cloudy climate. Genes and culture are not separate stories, they are spirals influencing each other over time. You see similar feedback loops elsewhere. The spread of dairying helped favour lactase persistence. The use of boats, nets and fish storage technologies made marine diets sustainable in harsh winters. Each new cultural tool altered the body's evolutionary pressures slightly, nudging gene frequencies one way or another. And that's why there is no single northern latitude solution to the vitamin D problem. Some populations leaned heavily on diet, coastal fish, marine mammals, organ meats. Others leaned more on skin lightening under sparse sunlight, especially where farming tied them to grain fields instead of fishing grounds. Some did both. Still others adopted cultural workarounds much later. Fermented foods, fortified staples, eventually supplements. The result is a mosaic. Different human groups in similar UV regimes arrived at adequate vitamin D through different mixtures of genes, foods, and behaviors. Bone health in the north wasn't guaranteed by any one adaptation. It was secured precariously by many small adjustments woven together. And all of this, the way sunlight, diet, clothing, housing and genetics interplay around a single hormone-like molecule, is just one example of a bigger pattern. Our bodies are not simply shaped by climate or food in isolation. They're shaped by the ever-shifting dialogue between what the environment demands, what culture invents, and what our genes can offer in response. That dialogue doesn't stop at the skin or the skeleton. It reaches into the very shape of our bodies, the length of our limbs, the way we hold heat and shed it. In cold wind-scoured plains and humid tropical forests alike, evolution has been quietly sculpting human proportions to fit the physics of temperature and surface area. Think about your own body for a moment, not the details you see in a mirror, but the physics underneath. You are a warm, wet, slightly leaky heat engine trying to keep your core temperature in a narrow band, while the outside world swings from baking hot to bitter cold. Every hour of every day your body is moving heat around, generating it from metabolism, losing it through your skin and breath, holding onto it or dumping it depending on what the environment throws at you. And the shape of your body matters for that. Biologists have long noticed a broad pattern in warm-blooded animals. In colder regions you tend to see stockier forms, shorter limbs, more compact bodies, less exposed surface for every unit of volume. In hotter regions you often see the opposite, longer limbs, slimmer builds, more surface area to let heat escape. These observations have names: Bergmann's rule for body size, Allen's rule for limb length. They are not iron laws, and they don't predict any individual's body shape, but as rough statistical tendencies across many species and many climates, they show up again and again. Humans are part of that. When anthropologists compare skeletal remains across different environments, certain trends emerge. Long, narrow bodies and relatively long limbs are more common in populations whose ancestors lived in hot, often humid climates. More compact trunks and shorter limbs appear more often in populations whose ancestors faced cold, especially dry cold with wind and wide temperature swings. From a heat balance perspective, the logic is simple. A long, slim body has more skin relative to its internal volume. That means more area to dump heat through sweating and radiation when the air is hot and still. A shorter, rounder body has less exterior per unit of interior. That makes it easier to hold on to heat when the air is cold and dry, and every bit of warmth you lose has to be replaced with precious calories. But reality is never quite as tidy as the textbook diagram. Those rules are tendencies, not destinies. They describe averages in big samples, not fixed categories of cold-adapted people and heat-adapted people. And even when the pattern holds, climate is only one voice in the choir. Nutrition matters, growth conditions matter, lifestyle matters. If a child grows up under chronic undernutrition, frequent infections or heavy physical stress, their adult stature and limb proportions can end up very different from what their genes might have allowed under ideal conditions. Long bones, especially in the legs, are sensitive to developmental stress. You can't look at someone's height and leg length and cleanly separate climate from childhood circumstances. Historically, you can see this within the same genetic population over just a few generations. As diets improve, disease burdens drop, and workloads change, average height shoots up, limbs lengthen, bodies lean out. That's not evolution in the genetic sense. That's the environment of development, leaving its fingerprint on bodies. So when researchers talk about thermoregulation and body proportions, they're talking about slow, long-term trends across many generations layered on top of short-term life history effects in each person. Now place yourself, not in a cold northern forest, but in a hot, dry, open landscape. Heat, there is a different kind of problem. In a humid rainforest, sweat struggles to evaporate. The air is already saturated with water. In a dry savanna or desert, evaporation works very well, sometimes too well. You can dump heat quickly, but you also risk drying out. A tall, relatively linear body with long limbs helps increase the surface area for heat loss and can keep more of the body farther from the baking ground. Longer legs mean more distance between your core and the hot surface you're walking on. A narrower torso makes it easier for air to circulate around you as you move. At the same time, in open, sun-blasted landscapes, water management is crucial. Sweating is effective, but every drop lost must be replaced. Physiologies that balance efficient cooling with careful water use can be favoured. Sweat glands that respond quickly but shut off when not needed. Cardiovascular systems that move blood to the skin when it's safe and pull it back when you stand in shade. Aridity also changes how nights feel. Deserts can be blisteringly hot by day and sharply cool after sunset. Bodies in these regions must navigate not just too hot but too hot, then suddenly cold, often with strong winds stripping away heat. That can favour strategies that are good at both dumping heat when moving under the sun and preserving it when you're still and the air cools. The result over long spans is not a single perfect hot climate body plan, but a set of workable compromises shaped by local trade-offs: heat versus water, day versus night, movement versus rest. In Europe, where winters could be severe but summers could still be warm, different compromises emerged. Stockier builds and shorter limbs help conserve heat in long, cold seasons, especially when fuel is scarce and clothing is imperfect. But too much bulk can be costly in summer or during intense physical work. Over tens of thousands of years, various European populations settled into different points along this continuum, depending on how glacial pulses, forests, grasslands and coastlines shifted around them. In Africa, with its enormous ecological range from cool highlands to humid forests to bone-dry deserts, the story is even more varied. Some groups show very linear builds, consistent with long histories in hot, open environments. Others, especially in cooler highlands or more variable climates, show different patterns. There is no single African body type, just as there is no single European body type, and there's another twist. People do not stay put. Mobility and admixture scramble these neat diagrams. Over the last tens of thousands of years, human groups have moved, mixed, split, and rejoined countless times. A community living in a cold climate today may carry genetic ancestry from people who evolved in warmer regions, and vice versa. Parents from different backgrounds can pass on a blend of limb lengths, torso shapes, and metabolic traits to their children, who then grow up in yet another environment entirely. That means that within any continent, within any country, within any city, you will see a spread of body proportions. Some of that variation reflects deep evolutionary histories in different climates. Some reflects recent ancestry from elsewhere. Some reflects nothing more than who got enough to eat in childhood, who had repeated infections, who worked physically from a young age and who did not. Thermoregulation has certainly nudged human body shapes over time. The physics of surface area and volume are real. Heat balance matters, especially when calories are hard to come by and shelter and clothing are limited. But it's only one part of a tangled web of influences that includes development, disease, diet, workload, and migration. So when people point to differences in average stature or limb proportions between, say, some European populations and some African populations, and try to tell a simple climate story, they're skipping most of the interesting parts. The reality is layered and local. Tall, linear bodies appear in multiple regions for multiple reasons. Stockier builds show up in very different peoples who happen to face similar energetic constraints. In other words, what you're seeing is not continents turning into different types of humans, but many small human groups solving their own heat and energy problems in many slightly different ways, then mixing, moving, and reshaping the picture again. And those local solutions weren't only about temperature. Height, strength, endurance, and body form all fed into another pressure that was just as important as climate: how you made a living. Hunting, gathering, running, rowing, climbing. All of these left their own marks on human bodies long before farming and cities arrived. Now imagine changing not just the temperature but the very air you breathe. You walk uphill, at first it's just a slope, then it's a climb. Eventually you are 2, 3, 4 kilometers above sea level. The landscape is beautiful, the sun feels close, but something invisible has changed. Every breath now contains less oxygen. Not because the air has run out, but because air pressure has dropped. The molecules are farther apart. With each lungful, fewer oxygen molecules make it into your bloodstream. This is hypoxia, oxygen shortage, and your body does not like it. If you or I, born and raised at sea level, travel quickly to high altitude, the reaction is immediate and messy. Your breathing speeds up, your heart races. You may feel dizzy, nauseated, exhausted by small efforts. Your body is desperately trying to push more oxygen to your tissues. Stay for days or weeks, and you acclimatize, you make more red blood cells. You shift how you use energy. You might still feel slower, but you can function. Now stretch the same problem over thousands of years. Take a human group, move them into a high plateau or mountain valley, and keep them there for hundreds of generations. If they have enough numbers, enough time, and enough gene flow among the survivors, something deeper than acclimatization can happen. Natural selection can begin reshaping how their bodies handle thin air. High altitude is one of the clearest examples of this kind of long-term environment-driven change. It is also a clear reminder that there is never just one solution. Different populations in different mountain systems have solved the hypoxia problem in different ways. Consider the African highlands. Eastern Africa is not just savanna and rift valleys. It also holds some of the highest plateaus on the continent. The Ethiopian highlands, for instance, sit thousands of meters above sea level, with human communities living and farming at elevations that would leave many lowlanders gasping. People there are not just sea-level bodies doing their best. There is growing evidence that some East African highland populations carry genetic changes that help them cope with low oxygen. The details are still being worked out, and not all studies agree, but certain patterns keep showing up. Compared to lowland outsiders, some Ethiopian highlanders tend to have relatively normal or only slightly elevated hemoglobin levels, even at high altitude. They avoid the extreme blood-thickening response that you see when someone from the coast spends a long time in the mountains. That matters, because pumping very thick blood is hard on the heart and blood vessels. It can increase the risk of complications like chronic mountain sickness. A strategy that maintains oxygen delivery without overloading the circulatory system is a better long-term solution. Genetic analyses point to regions of the genome under selection in these populations, including some that influence how the body senses oxygen and regulates red blood cell production. The exact mutations often differ from those found in other high-altitude peoples elsewhere in the world. That suggests not one universal high-altitude gene, but multiple local tweaks to the same basic physiological systems. It's a reminder to be cautious. Researchers can see the fingerprints of selection, and they can measure certain physiological traits, but connecting specific DNA changes to exact outcomes in complex environments is always a work in progress. The picture for African highlanders is especially incomplete, simply because fewer studies have been done compared to famous cases in Asia and the Americas. Now contrast that with Europe. Europe has high mountains, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Carpathians, but it tells a different demographic story. For most of the last tens of thousands of years, European populations have used mountains more as boundaries, pastures, and seasonal routes than as permanent, densely populated homelands at very high elevation. There are traditional communities in places like the Alps that live above what many of us would consider a high hill, but compared with the Tibetan Plateau or the Ethiopian highlands, the number of people spending their entire lives at extreme altitudes in Europe has been relatively small, and the time depth of such settlement is shorter. Add to that the fact that modern European mountain communities often have ready contact with lower valleys through trade, marriage and migration, and you get weaker, more diluted selection for specialized high-altitude physiologies. The result, when geneticists go looking for signatures of strong, long-term high-altitude adaptation in Europeans, they do not see the same dramatic patterns found in some African or Asian highlanders. That doesn't mean European mountain populations have no adaptations at all. Some subtle differences likely exist, and cultural strategies, clothing, housing, work patterns also play a big role. But the evolutionary pressure to rebuild the basic oxygen-handling machinery of the body has simply been less intense and less sustained. And this is where the story widens out, when scientists compare highland peoples across the world, Andean groups in South America, Tibetan populations in Asia, Ethiopian highlanders in Africa. They see something fascinating. All of them face the same physical problem: too little oxygen. All of them show signs of adaptation, but they have not all solved the problem in the same way. Some Andean populations have very high hemoglobin levels, a strategy that packs more oxygen into each milliliter of blood, with trade-offs for heart and lung strain. Many Tibetans, by contrast, show relatively modest rises in hemoglobin, but increased breathing rates and blood flow, improving oxygen delivery without such heavy blood loading. Ethiopians appear to have yet another pattern, avoiding both extremes in different ways. At the genetic level, the story is similar. Genes involved in oxygen sensing, blood vessel growth, and red blood cell regulation show signs of selection in all these places, but often it is not the same mutations, not even always the same genes. In Tibetans, for example, one of the strongest signals involves a gene region with ancient Denisovan ancestry, evidence of past interbreeding with those archaic humans, contributing a useful variant for life on the plateau. In Ethiopians, candidate regions under selection tend to be different, shaped by their own histories, their own mixtures, their own landscapes. This is convergent evolution in action. Different human populations, facing similar environmental stress, thin air at altitude, have independently evolved different biological workarounds. The convergence is in the function: better performance in low oxygen. The solutions are diverse: altered breathing, altered blood chemistry, altered vascular responses, different genetic pathways leading to roughly the same outcome. And importantly, none of these solutions is better in any global sense. They are better only in context. Better for farming on a cool African plateau, for herding yaks on a windy Asian steppe, for tending llamas on a South American ridge. Move any of these populations suddenly to sea level, or into a different climate with different diseases and diets, and the old advantages may fade or even become liabilities. High altitude adaptations are a clean illustration of a deeper point that runs through this entire story. Environment's present problems. Human groups find ways, cultural, technological, and sometimes genetic, to solve them. Different histories, different neighbours, different trade routes, and different accidents along the way mean that even when the problem is the same, the solutions diverge. What we call European or African biology is really a patchwork of these local problem-solving episodes. Highland and lowland, forest and savanna, coast and desert, each carving its own faint pattern into the genome, each leaving traces that only make sense when you put them back into the landscape that shaped them. Before fields of wheat and herds of cattle, there was something much older and far more flexible: foraging. For most of our species' history in Africa and in Europe, people lived by moving through landscapes and pulling food out of whatever those landscapes offered. And those landscapes were not all the same. Start with Africa. Imagine following a group across a year. In one season they're in open savanna, tracking antelope, zebra and smaller game, gathering tubers with tough skins and fibrous cores, cracking open nuts with heavy stones. In another season they're along a river, pulling in fish, scooping up freshwater mussels, collecting wild fruits and leafy greens. If they live near the coast, the menu changes again. Shellfish in the intertidal zone, beached whales when luck struck, seabirds, turtle eggs, seaweed, and fish caught with simple hooks or traps. We sometimes talk about hunter-gatherers as if they were one kind of people, living one kind of life. They weren't a forest edge in Central Africa, a dry steppe in Northern Africa, a mangrove coast in the east. Each of these ecologies shaped what food was available when it appeared and how risky it was to get. The same was true in Europe, just with a different cast of characters. In Ice Age Europe, before and between the big glaciers, human groups moved across cold steppe and patchy woodland. There the big prizes were reindeer, horses, bison, mammoth in some periods, along with hares, birds and fish, where rivers cut through the land. Edible plants were there too, berries, roots, nuts, but long winters and shorter growing seasons meant animal foods often carried more of the calorie load, especially in the far north. Further south, in what are now Mediterranean climates, the pattern shifted. Oak woodlands with acorns and other nuts, coastal lagoons full of shellfish and fish, wild cereals and grasses in certain valleys. Even within Europe, a forager on the Iberian coast and one in an inland Carpathian valley were living in different food worlds. What ties all of this together is that hunter-gatherer diets were not narrow. They were broad, opportunistic, and seasonal. If something was edible and worth the effort, someone, somewhere, figured out how to use it. One category of resource, though, seems to have had an especially deep influence on human biology and health: the sea. Marine foods, fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seaweeds are unusually rich in certain nutrients, including long-chain omega-3 fatty acids like DHA and EPA, iodine and other trace elements. These molecules play important roles in brain development, eyesight and cardiovascular health. Along many African coasts, there is archaeological evidence of people exploiting marine resources very early in our story. Shell middens, ancient piles of discarded shells, build up over thousands of years. Fish bones, burned shells, and tools suited for working coastlines tell us that some groups became specialized at reading tides, currents, and seasonal upwellings. In Europe's coastal zones, especially later in the Ice Age, and afterwards, similar patterns appear: heavy shell deposits, fish hooks, harpoons, and other gear tuned to watery environments. Some researchers have argued that access to rich marine diets might have supported aspects of brain growth and cognitive complexity in early modern humans because of the steady supply of these fatty acids and micronutrients. Others are more cautious, pointing out that inland diets, if diverse enough and including certain animal fats and organ meats, can also provide what brains need. The evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. What's clearer is that regular use of marine foods buffered people against some of the risks of purely terrestrial foraging. When big game migrated away or plant harvests failed, the sea might still be there, with shellfish clinging to rocks and fish moving along predictable routes. Coastal ecologies could smooth out the boom and bust cycles of inland hunting. Diet, over enough generations, can leave its fingerprints in our genomes. Think about fat first. Different foods supply different mixes of fatty acids: saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, shorter and longer chains. Populations that leaned heavily on certain kinds of animal fat, or marine oils or plant oils, would put different metabolic stresses on the body. Over time, slight differences in genes involved in fat digestion, transport and storage could be favoured or disfavoured. In some African populations, there are genetic variants affecting fatty acid metabolism that seem to have been under selection, possibly related to diets rich in particular plant oils or mixes of animal and plant fats. In northern Eurasia, including parts of Europe, some groups show signals of adaptation to high-fat, animal-heavy diets, potentially tied to cold climates where plant foods were scarcer for parts of the year. The details are still being untangled, and we should be careful. Multiple explanations, diet, climate, disease, even chance, can shape the same genes. Now think about starch. Roots, tubers, and later wild cereals are all sources of starch, but they're not evenly distributed across space or time. Some African ecologies offered abundant starchy underground storage organs if you knew how to find and detoxify them. In other regions, starchy seeds and grains were more prominent. In colder European environments, reliable starchy plants were patchier, especially during glacial maxima. One of the clearest genetic signals tied to starch is the AMI1 gene, which codes for salivary amylase, an enzyme that begins breaking down starch in the mouth. Many studies have found that populations with historically high starch diets tend to have more copies of this gene, producing more amylase. This isn't limited to Africans or Europeans, and it's not perfectly mapped to any single lifestyle, but it fits a broader pattern. Where starch was a big part of the diet, selection seems to have nudged metabolism toward handling it efficiently. The main point, though, is not that our ancestors were passively reshaped by food. It's that behaviour moved first. Cultural flexibility, changing what you eat, where you move, which technologies you use, works on timescales of days, years, and lifetimes. Genetic change, even under strong selection, works on timescales of many generations. When a drought hit, people didn't wait for new mutations. They shifted camps, tried new plant species, hunted different animals, traded with neighbouring groups who had access to other resources. When coastal groups realised that shellfish were safer or more predictable than chasing one more herd across a dry plain, they invested more effort in learning the tides, in passing that knowledge on. Inland groups experimented with grinding stones, cooking pits, fermentation, techniques that made otherwise marginal foods digestible. That speed matters for our story, because the more skillfully people could rearrange their diet using knowledge and tools, the less immediate the pressure on their genes. Only under consistent, repeating conditions, generation after generation of similar foods, similar shortages, similar risks, would the slow ratchet of natural selection have room to work on digestion, metabolism, and nutrient handling in a big way. And this brings us to the edge of a change unlike anything before. For hundreds of thousands of years, diet followed ecology. People moved to the food, or at least moved with it. They tracked migrating herds, seasonal fruiting, fish runs, shellfish spawning cycles. Their bodies carried small, accumulating signatures of these patterns, but the core strategy was always the same: flexibility, mobility, adaptation in culture first. Then, in a few regions and at different times, humans began to do something profoundly strange. They stopped only following the food and started remaking the landscape so that the food would follow them. They took wild grasses and began planting them in cleared patches. They penned animals instead of hunting them at a distance. They selected seeds from plants with bigger grains, calmer temperaments, less bitterness. They rearranged rivers, cut forests, burned fields in cycles, creating artificial ecologies that fed more people in smaller spaces. Agriculture didn't appear everywhere at once, and it didn't erase foraging overnight. But wherever it took hold, whether in parts of the Near East that would later influence Europe, or in multiple centres within Africa, it changed the rules. Diet was no longer primarily written by wild coasts and inland ecologies. It was increasingly written by human decisions, human labour, and human social systems. And that shift from following food to producing it would reshape both European and African bodies and histories on a scale no previous dietary change ever had. In Europe, that shift hit like an earthquake. It didn't start there. The earliest clear evidence for farming shows up further east, in what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, parts of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and surrounding regions. There, people gradually domesticated wild wheat and barley, lentils and peas, sheep, goats, later cattle. Over thousands of years, landscapes that had once supported scattered foragers turned into patchworks of small fields, grazing plots, and permanent villages. From this core, farming ways of life began to spread toward Europe. How exactly that happened has been argued over for decades. Was it ideas without people, neighbouring foragers watching, learning, and copying the techniques of their farming neighbours? Or was it people themselves, descendants of those Near Eastern farmers, physically moving into Europe, bringing their crops, animals, and DNA with them? The answer, as usual, seems to be some of both, but genetics tilts the scale strongly in one direction. When scientists look at ancient DNA from early European farmers, people living in places like the Balkans, Central Europe, the Mediterranean coast around 9,000 to 7,000 years ago, they don't look like the older hunter-gatherers who had occupied those regions since the Ice Age. Their genomes cluster far more closely with populations from Anatolia and the Near East. That's not what you get if local foragers just pick up a few new crops. That's what you get when waves of people move in. These early farmers carried domesticated wheat and barley, suited to temperate climates, as well as sheep, goats, and cattle. They followed river valleys and coastlines, leapfrogging along routes that gave their crops enough rain and their herds enough grazing. Archaeology and genetics together suggest a series of expansions, first into southeastern Europe, then into Central Europe along the Danube, and along the Mediterranean shore into Italy, southern France, Iberia. The long-term resident hunter-gatherers didn't just vanish. In some regions, they retreated into ecological niches that farmers didn't immediately want. Deep forests, rugged uplands, far northern coasts. In other places, they intermarried with the newcomers, sometimes quickly, sometimes over centuries. In the genetic record, you can see this as a blending. Early farmers are mostly Near Eastern derived. Later farming populations show more and more ancestry from European foragers. But numbers matter here. A mobile forager group might consist of a few dozen individuals. Even if their lands are rich, their population density stays low because they need space to follow game and let wild resources recover. A farming village, by contrast, can pack hundreds of people into an area that would once have supported a single band of hunters and gatherers. Multiply that by valley after valley, plain after plain, and you get something Europe had never seen before. Sustained population growth on a continental scale. More babies survived to adulthood because there was, on average, more food. That doesn't mean life was easy. Archaeology suggests that early farmers often worked harder, had more tooth decay and shorter adult stature than their forager neighbours, but sheer numbers won out. In evolutionary terms, reproductive success is what counts. Farming populations, despite their problems, were extraordinarily successful at reproducing. Dense villages, though, changed more than just head counts. For most of human history, disease dynamics had been shaped by small mobile groups. Pathogens that kill quickly or require large, continuous pools of hosts don't thrive when people live in tiny bands that split and fuse, moving hundreds of kilometers over a year. In that world, many infections burn out before they become permanent fixtures. Now picture early Neolithic Europe, houses built close together, waste pits, stored grain that attracts rodents and insects, livestock penned near human sleeping areas, people sharing air and water day after day. This is a different ecological theatre, and pathogens evolve to fit their stages. Some of the classic crowd diseases of later historical periods, measles, smallpox, certain flus, probably required even bigger, more connected populations than early farmers could sustain. But the groundwork was being laid. Zoonotic diseases, those that jump from animals to humans, had new opportunities as people lived cheek by jowl with sheep, goats, pigs and cattle. Intestinal parasites, waterborne infections and respiratory diseases could circulate more easily in packed communities. Diet shifted too. Foragers in both Europe and Africa tended to eat a wide range of foods, multiple plant species, varied animal parts, seasonal pulses of nuts, fruits, roots and meat. Early European farmers, in contrast, leaned heavily on a much narrower base. Cereals like wheat and barley, pulses like lentils and peas, and milk and meat from a few domesticated species. It was more predictable but also more monotonous. Shortages or crop failures hit harder when so many calories were tied up in a small number of species. From an evolutionary perspective, this is the kind of repetitive environment that selection can really bite into. If generation after generation, your main carbohydrates come from wheat and barley, small advantages in digesting those grains more efficiently can add up. If your immune system is constantly being challenged by pathogens that come from living near livestock, viruses and bacteria circulating through tightly packed villages, then tiny genetic differences in how you recognize or respond to those microbes can mean the difference between life and death, between 2 surviving children and 6. Selection doesn't need to be conscious. It just needs consistent conditions. And yet, even within this big Neolithic wave, Europe wasn't a single story. The spread of farming slowed and stalled at ecological frontiers. In the dense forests of northern Europe, Mediterranean wheat and barley didn't always do well at first. In the far north, and in some Atlantic coastal zones, rich marine resources and resilient foraging traditions made the farming package less obviously superior. There, hunter-gatherer lifeways persisted much longer, coexisting with small pockets of farmers or gradually blending with them. Even among farming communities, practices varied. Some regions emphasized cattle and dairying early on. Others leaned more on sheep and goats. In wetter areas, people could support larger herds in drier or rockier ones. They might depend more heavily on grains and legumes. Local soils, climates, and older traditions all nudged communities toward different combinations. Those differences mattered for biology. Populations that relied more heavily on dairy, for example, would later face strong selection around genes for digesting lactose. Groups whose crops suffered recurrent shortages might experience repeated famines. altering the selective environment for metabolism and fat storage. Communities regularly hit by certain pathogens would see immune-related genes shift, as those better matched to the local disease ecology left more descendants. The Neolithic transition in Europe was not a gentle adjustment. It was a demographic and ecological shockwave. New people, new foods, new diseases, new ways of living together in dense, semi-permanent communities. And as this wave rolled across the continent, it set up some of the key contrasts that would later distinguish European populations from many of their African cousins. Because while farming was also taking root in Africa, it did so under different skies, with different crops, animals and disease landscapes, and on very different timelines. In Africa, the story of farming is less a single wave and more a constellation. There isn't one neat Neolithic package marching across the landscape. There are multiple centres, multiple experiments, unfolding at different times in different regions, all layered on top of an already deep and diverse human presence. Start in the northeast, because that's where the outside world usually looks first. Crops and animals from the Near East did enter Africa. Wheat, barley, sheep, goats, later cattle and some technologies, filtered down through the Sinai and along the Nile thousands of years ago. In Egypt and the Sudanese Nile Valley, those imports mixed with local traditions to create riverine farming societies, fields watered by predictable annual floods, cereals and flax grown on the rich silt, cattle and sheep grazing higher ground. But already, this looks different from much of Europe. The Nile is not a rainy temperate plain. It's a narrow green ribbon through desert. Population clusters densely along its banks, but step a few kilometres away and you're in arid or semi-arid land where rain-fed cereals struggle. Selection pressures here favour people who can manage flood cycles, irrigate, store grain, and cope with diseases linked to standing water. Things like schistosomiasis, carried by snails in irrigation channels. Different river, different crops, different pathogens, different evolution. Move west from the Nile into what is now the Sahel, the broad belt south of the Sahara, and you find another story. Here, African groups domesticated their own plants. Sorghum, pearl millet, fonio, cowpeas, and other hardy crops gradually shifted from wild stands to managed fields. These species were built to survive erratic rainfall, intense sun, and poor soils better than the Near Eastern cereals could. They became the backbone of dryland farming in much of West and Central Africa. Rainfall in these regions is not steady and predictable year after year. It comes in concentrated seasons, and those seasons can shift north or south, grow longer or shorter, for decades at a time. Entire villages might see good harvests for a generation, then be hammered by drought. Under those conditions, you don't necessarily get dense, continuous village chains like early Neolithic Europe. You get flexible settlement patterns, people clustering where water and grazing are good, then moving or sending offshoots when conditions change. That variability shapes biology. If your subsistence base is sorghum and millet, processed into porridges and beers, selection will act on how you handle those starches, how you store energy through lean years, how you respond to periodic famine. If your communities expand and contract with the rains, crowd diseases have a harder time establishing the kind of permanent, continent-wide foothold they later did in dense year-round farming regions. Malaria and other vector-borne diseases, on the other hand, thrive in the warm, seasonal wetlands and puddles left by monsoon rains. Further south and east, yet another pattern emerges. In parts of East Africa, people took up a way of life that was neither pure farming nor pure foraging, but something in between, mixed economies and especially pastoralism. Cattle in Africa are not a simple Near Eastern import. There is ongoing debate about how much was independently domesticated versus introduced and then heavily reshaped by African environments and breeders. But by several thousand years ago, herding cultures were spreading through the savannas and highlands from the Nile corridor into what is now Kenya, Tanzania and beyond. Here, ecology matters again. Savanna landscapes with seasonal grasses and scattered trees are not ideal for rain-fed wheat, but they can be excellent for grazing cattle, sheep and goats, especially if you're willing to move with the seasons. Pastoralists developed lifeways built around mobility, following pastures, tracking water sources, managing herd composition, and exchanging milk, meat, hides, and animals with neighbouring farmers and foragers. In these systems, food production often means milk first, meat second. That's not a minor detail for evolution. If your main reliable calories come from milk rather than grain, and you're consuming it not just as a weaned toddler, but as a teenager, an adult, a pregnant mother, then any genetic variant that lets you digest lactose into adulthood is going to be a serious advantage. We'll come back to this in the lactase persistence section. But the groundwork is laid here. Pastoralism on African grasslands creates one of the strongest and most consistent selection pressures for adult milk digestion anywhere on Earth. At the same time, pastoralism pulls people into some of the most intense disease landscapes on the planet. The tropical belt of Africa, especially West and Central Africa, is riddled with parasites and pathogens that attack both humans and livestock. Tsetse flies transmit trypanosomes that cause sleeping sickness in people and a deadly wasting disease in cattle. Malaria parasites circulate through Anopheles mosquitoes. Waterborne and soil-borne parasites flourish in warm, wet soils. These belts act like biological filters. In Tsetse-heavy zones, large herds of cattle are almost impossible to maintain without modern veterinary tools. That's one reason why pure cattle pastoralism historically thrived more in Tsetse-free highlands and drier savannas, and why in some humid regions people relied more on crops, small livestock, or fishing. Disease ecology, not just climate, carved out where different food systems could persist. Where dense farming did take hold in Africa, around the Nile, in some parts of the Ethiopian highlands, in fertile lake basins, you do see higher settlement densities, more permanent villages, and eventually towns and states with disease dynamics that start to resemble those of Eurasian centres. But across vast areas, flexible, mixed strategies remained the norm, some farming, some herding, some fishing, some foraging, in combinations tuned to local rainfall, soils, disease risks, and existing traditions. Then, later still, another farming wave swept much of sub-Saharan Africa, the spread of Bantu-speaking peoples and their crops, especially yams, oil palms, later bananas and plantains brought from Asia, plus ironworking. That expansion, again, did not erase what came before so much as layer over it, mixing with older pastoralists and foragers, adapting to forests, savannas and river valleys in different ways. All of this means that in Africa, agriculture is not a single switch being flipped from forager to farmer. It's a mosaic of systems: riverine grain farmers in the northeast, sorghum and millet cultivators in the Sahel, banana and root crop gardeners in wetter equatorial zones, mobile cattle and camel pastoralists in savannas and deserts, and countless mixed strategies in between. Each system brings its own diet profile, its own disease exposures, its own patterns of mobility and crowding. And each of those patterns nudges evolution in a slightly different direction, where milk is central and herds are large. Genes for digesting lactose or handling certain animal-borne pathogens can spread rapidly. Where malaria is intense and year-round, variants that confer partial resistance, even at the cost of problems like sickle cell disease, can be strongly favoured. Where root crops and tropical fruits dominate, Selection may lean on different digestive and metabolic pathways than in cereal heavy temperate diets. In Europe, the Neolithic transition was a relatively coherent package, a few core crops and animals, spreading under broadly similar temperate climates. In Africa, there were multiple origins, multiple timelines, and constantly shifting ecological and disease frontiers. The result is a continent where gene culture evolution has been exceptionally local. The same species, but populations tuned to particular foods, climates, and pathogens in exquisitely detailed ways. And one of the clearest examples of that tuning, of culture rewriting our genomes in response to milk, herds, and new disease ecologies, is the evolution of lactase persistence. To understand lactase persistence, start with something almost every mammal has in common. Baby mammals drink milk to handle the sugar in that milk, lactose. They produce an enzyme in the small intestine called lactase. Lactase breaks lactose into simpler sugars the body can absorb. While you're nursing, this is essential. Without lactase, milk gives you gas, cramps, diarrhea, dehydration. Not ideal for a newborn, but in almost every mammal, including most humans through most of history, lactase production drops off sharply after weaning. From an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. Enzymes are costly. Why keep cranking out a protein designed for digesting milk once you're eating meat, roots, grains, and fruits? So in the default mammalian setting, lactase gets turned down in childhood. Adults become effectively lactose intolerant. Not because something is wrong, but because that's the normal state. Lactase persistence is the exception. In some human populations, a genetic change in the control switches for the lactase gene means the off signal never really arrives. The enzyme stays active into adolescence and adulthood. People with this trait can drink fresh milk at 15, 30, 60 years old and digest it just as easily as they did at 15 months. On its own, that would just be a biochemical curiosity. What makes it important is culture. For most of our species' time on Earth, there was no selection pressure for adult milk digestion because there was almost no adult milk drinking. You weaned. You stopped getting milk. Your lactase levels dropped. End of story. Pastoralism blew that story open once humans began herding cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and later other milk-producing animals. A new food niche appeared. A renewable, portable, calorie-rich liquid resource that followed you around on the hoof. A cow is not just meat you slaughter once, it's milk every day for years. Now imagine a community where milk is suddenly available not just for toddlers, but for everyone. In a drought year, when crops fail or wild foods are scarce, a herd that can be milked becomes a moving pantry. In high marginal lands where cereals won't grow reliably, milk can be a staple. For pregnant women and young children, it's not just calories, it's fat, protein, calcium, and in some environments, vitamin D all bundled together. But that only works if your body can handle lactose. In a group that drinks a lot of fresh milk, individuals who keep making lactase into adulthood can tap into a whole extra food source without paying a digestive penalty. Individuals whose lactase switches off get sick if they try to rely on milk. They might avoid it and lose that nutritional buffer, or they might drink it anyway and risk dehydration and infection from repeated diarrhea, especially in hot climates or times of scarcity. That's where natural selection walks in. In Europe, when Neolithic farmers and later pastoralists spread, they brought cattle and sheep into landscapes where winters are dark, rainy, and cold, and harvests can be unpredictable. Over time in some of these populations, a mutation arose near the lactase gene, a tiny tweak in the regulatory DNA that kept lactase turned on for life. Genetic studies show something astonishing about that European lactase persistence variant. Once pastoralism and dairying were in place, that little regulatory change spread with rare speed. In evolutionary terms, It's like watching a gene go viral. People who could digest milk had a survival and fertility edge. Their children were more likely to live through famines. Their daughters could bear healthy babies more often. Their sons grew up stronger in communities that leaned on dairy. We see the result today in northern and parts of Central Europe. The majority of people carry that lactase persistence variant. Fresh milk as an everyday drink makes sense there because the population has been shaped by thousands of years of selection in a dairy-rich environment. But Europe is only half the story. In Africa, especially in cattle herding and camel herding societies of the East African highlands, the savannas and parts of the Sahara and Sahel, we see extremely high frequencies of lactase persistence as well. Yet when geneticists looked closely, they found something different. The switch is in the same general region of the genome, the regulatory area near the lactase gene, but the specific mutations are not the same as the European one. There are multiple distinct changes, arising independently in different African pastoralist groups, that all end up doing almost the same thing, keeping lactase turned on. This is convergent evolution in real time. Different populations in different places facing similar cultural and ecological pressures, a heavy reliance on fresh milk in adulthood, arrive at similar biological solutions through different genetic paths. It's like separate teams solving the same engineering problem with slightly different designs, all of which keep the machine running. In East African pastoralist societies where milk can make up a large share of calories, the selection pressures are intense. If being able to digest milk means you're more likely to survive a dry season, more likely to wean your children successfully when crops fail, more likely to stay fertile and healthy, then even a small genetic advantage can be amplified generation after generation. Over 1,000 years or two, you can see a once rare variant race through a population. But the story isn't just milk equals lactase persistence. Many cultures that adopted dairy did something clever. They changed the milk instead of changing their genes. Fermenting milk into yogurt, kefir, or many traditional sour milk products lets bacteria digest a big chunk of the lactose before you drink it. Turning milk into cheese removes most of the liquid whey, where much of the lactose is. Boiling milk, mixing it into porridges, or drinking it in small amounts spaced through the day, can also soften the digestive blow for people whose lactase levels have dropped. These processing techniques dramatically reduce the lactose load. They make dairy usable even in populations where most adults are lactose intolerant in the biological sense. That's why you can have long-standing dairy traditions in places like the Mediterranean, the Middle East, South Asia, and parts of Africa, even when lactase persistence isn't nearly as common as in Northern Europe or certain East African pastoralist groups. Culture, in other words, offers two broad paths: reshape the food or reshape the body. Many societies do both in some environments, where pastoralism is central, famines are recurrent, and fresh milk is abundant. The payoff for reshaping the body is high, and lactase persistence genes explode. In others, where dairy is a supplement, not a staple, processing milk is enough, and the genetic pressure is weaker. Lactase persistence may spread, but more slowly, or not at all. Seen this way, the differences between many European and many African populations are not about who is more advanced or who handles milk better. They're about different histories of herding, climate, famine, and cultural innovation playing out on the same basic human genome. And lactase persistence is just one example. The same pattern, new cultural practices creating new food niches, pathogens and lifestyles, and genes racing to keep up, shows up again and again. Nowhere is that clearer than in the battle against one of the deadliest forces in human history, malaria. To understand that battle, shift your attention from milk to mosquitoes. Malaria is not just a bad disease. For large parts of tropical Africa, and for other warm, wet regions from the Mediterranean to India to Melanesia, It has been one of the strongest, most relentless selection pressures humans have ever faced. It's caused by Plasmodium parasites, delivered into the bloodstream by Anopheles mosquitoes. Once inside, they invade your liver, then your red blood cells, cycling through stages that cause fever, chills, anemia, organ damage. Some species of Plasmodium are relatively mild. One, Plasmodium falciparum, is not. In untreated cases, especially in children, it can kill with terrifying speed. Now imagine what this looks like over centuries. In a village surrounded by warm, shallow water, swamps, seasonal pools, rice paddies, slow streams, mosquitoes breed in immense numbers. Every rainy season, children get sick. Some recover. Some don't. Adults are repeatedly infected. A few survive enough bouts to build partial immunity, but even then, pregnancy and illness can strip away that protection. Year after year, generation after generation, malaria keeps cutting down the most vulnerable. Natural selection pays attention to that. Any genetic variant that even slightly reduces the risk of dying from malaria in childhood can have an outsized effect on who leaves descendants. Children who survive to adulthood can have children of their own. Children who die cannot. Over hundreds or thousands of years, that difference compounds. One of the starkest examples is the sickle cell trait. Hemoglobin, the molecule that carries oxygen in red blood cells, comes in different genetic flavors. One variant, called HBS, changes the structure of hemoglobin just enough that under low oxygen conditions, red blood cells can bend into a sickle shape. If you inherit one copy of the HBS variant and one normal copy, what geneticists call heterozygous, you have sickle cell trait. Most of your red blood cells behave normally most of the time. But for the malaria parasite, your blood is suddenly a hostile environment. Infected sickling cells are more likely to be removed by the spleen before the parasite finishes its life cycle. The result: people with sickle cell trait are significantly less likely to die of severe falciparum malaria, especially in childhood. If you inherit two copies of HBS, though the story changes. With two HBs copies, many of your red blood cells sickle even under ordinary conditions. These inflexible cells can clog tiny blood vessels, causing intense pain, organ damage, chronic anemia. This is sickle cell disease, a serious and often life-shortening condition, especially without modern medical care. So why doesn't natural selection simply eliminate HBS? Because in malarial environments the trade-off works in its favour. The heterozygote advantage, one copy good, two copies bad, creates what biologists call balanced selection. The allele is never driven to 100% because the double dose is too costly. But it's never driven to 0% either, because one copy carriers gain a powerful survival edge against malaria. When you map sickle cell frequencies, something remarkable appears. The highest levels are not spread evenly across Africa. They form belts that track historical malaria zones, lowland, humid, mosquito-rich regions. You also see sickle cell in parts of the Middle East, India and the Mediterranean, but again, clustered in places where falciparum malaria has been intense. It's not an African gene. It's a gene favoured by a particular disease ecology that many African populations and some non-African ones have had to endure. And sickle cell is not alone. Another well-known adaptation is G6PD deficiency. G6PD is an enzyme that helps protect red blood cells from certain kinds of oxidative damage. People with reduced G6PD activity can develop anemia when exposed to specific drugs, foods, or infections. In severe forms, it's dangerous. Yet multiple G6PD variants are common in historically malarial regions, including parts of Africa, the Mediterranean, and Asia. The best explanation is similar to sickle cell. a partial deficiency makes life a bit harder for red blood cells and for the malaria parasite inside them. Falciparum just doesn't thrive as well in those cells. Once again, a trait that can be harmful in some contexts persists because in a malarial setting, it helps keep children alive. There are other subtler defences too. Certain thalassemias, conditions that alter the amount or type of hemoglobin produced, also cluster where malaria has been rampant. Variants in immune system genes, in red cell surface proteins, in the way our bodies respond to infection, all show signs of having been tuned by the presence of this one parasite. But it's important to be precise here. Malaria isn't uniform across Africa, and it hasn't been constant over time. Altitude matters. In many highland regions, it's simply too cool for the right mosquitoes to thrive. Aridity matters. True deserts and very dry savannas can interrupt mosquito breeding cycles. Human land use matters too. Clear forests to create sunny puddles, irrigate fields, build dams or fish ponds, and you can inadvertently create mosquito havens. That means the genetic picture across the continent is a mosaic, not a single pattern. Coastal lowlands, river deltas, humid forest edges and irrigated valleys often show strong signals of selection for malaria resistance variants. Nearby highlands, drier uplands, or areas where malaria was historically rare may not. Two neighbouring groups might differ sharply in the frequencies of sickle cell or G6PD variants, simply because one lived closer to wetlands or rice paddies for long enough, while the other farmed drier fields or herded livestock in cooler hills. Agriculture plays a major role in this story. When people began clearing land and settling year-round near rivers, lakes and swamps, they changed the ecology of mosquitoes. Irrigation channels, standing water in hoofprints and ditches, pools around village wells, all of these can become breeding grounds. In many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the rise of intensive agriculture and permanent villages seems to have intensified malaria transmission compared to earlier, more mobile forager lifestyles. In that sense, malaria is part of the same feedback loop as dairy. A cultural shift, farming wet lowlands, building irrigated fields, living in dense, stable settlements, creates a new disease landscape. That landscape, in turn, favours genetic variants that help people survive the new threats, even if those variants carry costs in other situations. Culture reshapes ecology. Ecology reshapes genes. So when you look at genetic differences between many African and many European populations today, some of what you're seeing is not about cold versus heat, or skin colour, or diet alone. It's about hundreds of generations spent in different pathogen worlds. One world where mosquitoes, parasites and fevers were inescapable companions for most of the year. Another where cold winters, sparser mosquito populations and different diseases set the terms of survival. Those European disease pressures would come into sharp focus much later in crowded towns and walled cities when new killers replaced malaria as the main agents of natural selection. To see that shift, move your mental camera north into a landscape of colder winters, stone walls and smoky wooden roofs. For a long time, much of Europe was relatively sparsely populated. Small farming villages, scattered homesteads, seasonal camps. Malaria did exist in some regions, marshy coasts, river valleys, warmer southern zones, but as you move into cooler, more seasonal climates, the mosquito season shrinks. Freezing winters break transmission chains, the disease world feels different. But then, slowly at first and then with gathering speed, Europe urbanizes. By the late Middle Ages, and especially from the 11th century onward, you start to see something new. Dense towns wedged inside walls, houses stacked against each other, livestock penned in courtyards and driven through narrow streets. Markets draw people from miles around. Trade routes stitched together villages, towns, ports, and inland cities into a network that runs from England to Italy, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and onward to the Middle East and Central Asia. With those networks came wealth, ideas, technologies, and pathogens. When people live scattered in small groups, infections have a hard time maintaining themselves. An outbreak burns through everyone susceptible, then fizzles out. The pathogen either kills its hosts too fast or runs out of bodies to infect before it can become a permanent resident in the population. Crowded towns change the math, pack thousands of people inside walls, add animals, pigs, chickens, cows, rats, sharing the same spaces, contaminating water sources, attracting fleas and lice. Layer on regular inflows of travellers, traders, pilgrims, soldiers, all carrying whatever microbes were circulating in their home regions. Suddenly, diseases that once appeared as occasional visitors can settle in, evolving into something much more dangerous. This is the environment where smallpox, measles, and later on, repeated waves of plague become regular features of life. Smallpox, caused by the variola virus, probably jumped into humans from an animal virus somewhere in the old world thousands of years ago. But it's in dense, interconnected societies that it really finds its ecological niche. It spreads by close contact and contaminated droplets. In a world of shared wells, crowded houses, and long overland journeys, it can move steadily from host to host, town to town. Measles, another crowd-loving virus, likely evolved from a cattle pathogen, rinderpest, once humans started keeping large herds. Like smallpox, it needs a big enough population to avoid going extinct between outbreaks. Estimates suggest you need hundreds of thousands of people in connected communities to sustain measles long term. That kind of demographic environment appears relatively late in human history, and it's exactly what medieval and early modern Eurasia began to supply. And then there's plague. The Black Death of the 14th century is the most famous, but Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind it, had been circulating in rodent populations long before. Trade routes, especially along the Silk Road and through the Black Sea, created bridges between those animal reservoirs and European ports. Fleas carrying the bacterium rode on rats in grain shipments, on ships, in carts. When they arrived in overcrowded towns with poor sanitation and abundant rodents, the stage was set. The impact on human lives was horrific. Entire villages emptied. Cities lost a third, half, sometimes more of their inhabitants in a single epidemic. Later waves kept coming. Smallpox scarred and killed, especially children. Measles, typhus, dysentery, influenza, they cycled through generations, part of the background risk of simply being alive in a world of crowded streets and shared air. So did all of this fundamentally reshape European genetics? Maybe, but the details are tricky. You will sometimes hear confident claims that the Black Death selected for certain immune genes, or that centuries of smallpox hardened European immune systems in some dramatic, uniform way. There is a kernel of truth in this logic. Any disease that kills a lot of people before they have children has the potential to shift gene frequencies. If certain variants help you fight off smallpox or survive a plague infection, those variants could become more common among the descendants of survivors. The challenge is proving it, unlike sickle cell, which rests on a relatively clear single gene with a big obvious effect. Many defenses against bacteria and viruses are spread across huge networks of genes. Immune cells rely on cascades of signals, receptors, and regulatory molecules. The same allele might be helpful against one pathogen, neutral against another, and harmful in a third context. Some variants might only make a tiny difference, shaving a few % off your risk of dying in a particular epidemic. Selection acting on those traits is more like quietly adjusting 1,000 knobs by a fraction of a turn than flipping one big switch. Geneticists call this polygenic adaptation. Polygenic just means many genes. Instead of one dramatic mutation sweeping through a population, you get small shifts at dozens or hundreds of sites in the genome. Detecting those shifts, especially when they happened centuries ago and when populations have been moving and mixing ever since, is extremely hard. A few recent studies have suggested that specific European immune genes may have been favoured after the Black Death, or during centuries of exposure to certain pathogens. They compare ancient DNA from pre- and post-plague burials and look for differences. Some of the results are intriguing, but this is an active debate. Sample sizes are often small. The statistical methods are complex and still being refined. Different research groups sometimes reach different conclusions from similar data, so we should be cautious. It's reasonable to think that repeated waves of epidemic disease in towns and cities nudged European gene pools in particular directions, especially in immune pathways. But it's not accurate to say Europeans are uniquely plague-adapted or smallpox-adapted in some simple, sweeping way. The story is more tangled, and it's not a story confined to Europe. Because while European towns were facing their own microbial storms, Africa was not standing still. From the cities of the Nile Valley to urban centres in the Sahel, from coastal trading hubs on the Swahili coast to inland caravan cities tied into trans-Saharan routes, many African regions also developed dense, complex settlements. They too kept livestock close to human homes. They too built trade corridors that moved people and pathogens across long distances. Their disease landscapes looked different in the details. More malaria and yellow fever in some zones, different mixes of bacterial and viral infections, different reservoirs in local animal populations. But the basic principle was the same. Culture created new kinds of crowding. Trade created new connections. Those changes reshaped which diseases mattered most, and over time they nudged genetic variation in subtle, polygenic ways that we are only beginning to untangle. So, when you compare the genomes of many Europeans with the genomes of many Africans today, you're seeing the layered imprint of different pathogen ecologies. Not one place with disease and another without. Not one population strong and another weak. Two continents, each with its own long, complicated history of towns, livestock trade, and the microbes that travelled with them. And those disease histories didn't unfold in isolation. The Sahara, far from being a hard wall, was a shifting frontier where people, goods, and pathogens moved back and forth, connecting these evolving worlds in ways that would keep shaping both genes and cultures for thousands of years. To really see that, you have to stop imagining the Sahara as this eternal, unchanging ocean of sand. For most of human history, it wasn't. On long time scales, the Sahara breathes. Every so often, on the order of 10,000 years or so, the tilt of the Earth's axis and the wobble of its orbit shift the way sunlight falls on the tropics. That changes the strength and position of the West African monsoon. Sometimes the rains push far to the north. Lakes fill, rivers flow, grasslands and woodlands spread across what is now barren desert. Hippos wallow where today there is only dust. Humans, plants, animals all move in. Then, slowly the monsoon weakens. The green retreats. Lakes shrink into puddles and then vanish. Dunes creep across old riverbeds. What had been a savanna full of life becomes, again, one of the harshest environments on the planet. From the point of view of evolution, this matters a lot. Because each time the Sahara greens, it stops being a wall and becomes a bridge. In its wet phases, what geologists call the Green Sahara, or African humid periods, you get corridors of habitable land stretching from the Sahel in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north. People living in what's now Mali or Niger could, in principle, walk north through belts of grassland following rivers and lakes, all the way to what's now Libya or Tunisia, without ever crossing a true desert. Archaeology and genetics both hint that they sometimes did. Stone tools, rock art, and ancient lake shore camps trace paths of human occupation right through the heart of the modern Sahara during these humid phases. Animal bones show species that today are confined far to the south. And when geneticists look at certain lineages in North Africa and the Sahel, they see signals that people moved back and forth repeatedly as climates shifted. Then, as aridity returns, those same corridors close. Populations that once had easy overland connections get cut off from each other. Groups that had been part of a continuous band of settlement become islands around oases, river valleys and coastlines. Where there was once a broad zone of mixing, you now have a filter. Only the most mobile, well-organized, desert-adapted peoples can keep moving across. That alternation, open bridge, closed barrier, open again, helps explain why genetic differences between, say, Berber-speaking groups in the north and many communities in the West African Sahel are real, but not absolute. Over tens of thousands of years, pulses of contact and pulses of isolation have layered on top of each other. And then in the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, another ingredient enters the picture: herds. As some parts of the Sahara and its margins dried, people didn't simply retreat. They adapted their economies to mobility, instead of relying mainly on hunting and gathering or on fixed fields. More and more communities turned to pastoralism, herding sheep, goats, cattle and later camels, moving seasonally to follow water and pasture. A mobile herd is, in a sense, a portable ecosystem. It turns scrub and sparse grass into milk, meat, hides, and trade goods. It allows human groups to treat a marginal, patchy landscape as something you can live in long term, if you know its rhythms. Pastoralists became the specialists of this breathing frontier. When the desert was relatively mild, they could range far into its interior. When conditions worsened, they could retreat toward better watered regions, bringing knowledge and genes from one edge of the Sahara to the other. Over centuries, waves of mobile herders linked North Africa, the Sahel, and eventually the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern worlds. Later, with the domestication and spread of the dromedary camel, that mobility went into overdrive. Camels turned some of the most hostile parts of the Sahara into traversable highways. Not easy highways, journeys were still dangerous, and many died, but routes that could sustain regular caravans. Salt from Saharan deposits could be hauled south. Gold, slaves, cola nuts, and other goods could be carried north. Ideas, religious movements, technologies and pathogens travelled with them. So did people themselves. Over many generations, caravan traders didn't just move goods. They married, settled, formed new communities at oases and market towns. Children born in these junction points might have grandparents from very different regions. Amazigh-speaking North Africans, Arabic speakers from the Mediterranean coast, Mande-speaking farmers from the Niger Bend, Fulani or Tuareg pastoralists who knew every waterhole for hundreds of miles. Genetic studies today pick up the echo of these processes. Some North African populations carry clear traces of ancestry related to sub-Saharan West and Central Africans layered on top of older North African and Mediterranean components. Some Sahelian groups show detectable North African and even Eurasian-related ancestry. In the Mediterranean itself, on islands like Sicily, Sardinia, and in parts of southern Spain, there are hints of back-and-forth movement across the water and indirectly across the desert beyond. What that means in practical terms is that the genetic boundary between Europe, North Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa has never been a razor-sharp line. It has been more like a set of shifting gradients, tugged back and forth by climate and by culture. When the Sahara was green, those gradients smoothed out as people and animals moved freely. When it dried, the gradients steepened, as isolation allowed local adaptations and local genetic drift to accumulate. Pastoralism, caravan trade, and later Islamic and Mediterranean networks repeatedly stretched new threads across the gap, softening those boundaries again. So when you look at modern genetic maps and see differences between, say, average Sicilian ancestry, average Moroccan ancestry, and average Yoruba ancestry, you're seeing a frozen snapshot of something that has been in motion for a very long time. Not two continents sealed off from each other since the dawn of time, but two regions connected by a living, breathing frontier, a desert that sometimes opened like a door, sometimes narrowed to a crack, yet almost never shut entirely. To see the other side of this, we have to leave the desert and go somewhere that, at first glance, seems like the opposite of the Sahara. The open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, from Hungary across Ukraine, southern Russia, Kazakhstan, all the way toward Mongolia, there's this enormous belt of mostly treeless grasslands. Winters are brutal, summers can be scorching, and rainfall is just enough to grow grass, not forests. It doesn't look like much, but for people who knew how to use horses and herd animals, it was a superhighway. Around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, something started happening on that highway that would permanently reshape the genetics of Europe. Archaeologists call some of the key steppe cultures Yamnaya, Sintashta, Andronovo, and so on. The names don't really matter for sleep. What matters is what they figured out. They were pastoralists on steroids. Cattle, sheep, goats, and especially horses weren't just food. They were engines. Carts, wagons, eventually light chariots, all pulled across endless grass by animals that could turn wild steppe into calories and mobility. These groups could move their entire communities. People, tents, belongings, hundreds of kilometers over a few seasons. And they did. Genetic studies of ancient skeletons have shown something that used to sound like wild speculation, and is now hard to deny. Massive waves of people with steppe ancestry poured into Europe between about 3000 and 2000 BCE. Not just traders, not just a few warriors, whole populations. If you look at old farming villages in Central and Northern Europe from before this period, the descendants of earlier Neolithic farmers from Anatolia mixed with local hunter-gatherers, they have a certain genetic profile. A couple of centuries later, many of those same regions are full of people whose DNA suddenly looks very different, heavily steppe-related, more similar to those pastoralists out on the Eurasian grasslands. In some areas, especially in the north, it looks like near total replacement. The majority of the ancestry of later Europeans there comes from these incoming groups, not from the earlier farmers. That's what geneticists mean by genetic turnover. On a map, it would look like colours sliding across the continent, one ancestry component surging forward, others shrinking back or blending. From an evolutionary point of view, this is important, because it shows how fast the genetic landscape can change without any slow, local adaptation being involved at first. You don't need thousands of years of natural selection to make a population look different. You can get big differences by moving people. If a group with slightly different average traits, height, skull shape, lactose tolerance, whatever, expands into a region and becomes the majority, the trait frequencies in that region can change in just a few generations. No mutation required, just demographics. Later, natural selection can still act on that new mix. But the first big shift is often a matter of who's having babies where. The steppe expansions are one of the clearest examples we have of this. Today, when geneticists analyse modern Europeans, they routinely see three big ancestral strands: older hunter-gatherer ancestry, early Neolithic farmer ancestry from the Near East, and steppe-related ancestry from these Bronze Age migrations. Different regions have different blends. In the far north and northeast, steppe ancestry can be very high. In the Mediterranean, early farmer ancestry stays stronger. In places like Central Europe and the British Isles, you get a more even mix, but still with a heavy steppe contribution compared to the pre-Bronze Age past. This is why if you draw a genetic map of Europe, you see smooth gradients northwest to southeast, southwest to northeast, rather than sharp blocks. Those gradients are, in part, the fading echo of waves that came from the steppe and mixed with people who were already there. Then there's the language question. Those same steppe groups are one of the prime candidates for the spread of Indo-European languages, the vast family that includes English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Persian, and many more. One influential theory says mobile herders with wagons and horses had a military and logistic advantage. As they expanded into Europe and parts of Asia, they didn't just bring genes, they brought a language family that, in various daughter forms, ended up dominating most of the continent. Another theory emphasizes earlier Anatolian farmers as the main carriers of Indo-European, with steppe peoples later amplifying or modifying that spread. The genetics alone can't fully settle this. We can see the bodies move in the ancient DNA. We can date the turnover events. We can line those up with archaeological cultures, burial styles, pottery types, weapon forms. But a language doesn't fossilize. All we can do is correlate. What the evidence does show, though, is that genes and culture are related, but not locked together. In some places you get strong steppe ancestry and Indo-European languages together. In other places, steppe ancestry arrives, but local traditions and languages seem to have more staying power, at least for a while, and over the following millennia, other movements, Phoenician traders, Greek colonists, Roman imperial expansion, later Slavic, Germanic and Turkic migrations layer more complexity on top. So when people ask, why are Northern and Southern Europeans genetically different? Or why do some regions have higher frequencies of this trait or that one? The steppe story is a big piece of the answer. It's not that the North evolved separately in place for 100,000 years while the South did its own thing. It's that repeated demographic pulses, first farmers from the southeast, then steppe herders from the northeast, then later movements again, kept reshaping who lived where, who mixed with whom, and which ancestries became common or rare. Some traits did undergo strong local selection on top of this. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk as an adult, likely rose in frequency faster in populations that combined dairying with certain diets. Height, immune genes, metabolism, lots of things were tweaked by environment and culture. But the background canvas those traits were painted on was being rolled out and rearranged by migration. In other words, the European look, whatever that means in someone's imagination, is not the product of a single, slow, isolated evolutionary path stretching back to the Ice Age. It's the temporary outcome of overlapping population waves, hunter-gatherers, farmers, steppe herders, each adding their own genetic threads, each leaving gradients that we can still measure in living people today. Just like the Sahara's breathing created shifting connection and isolation between Africa's regions, the steppe's openness created corridors for rapid movement that could flip the genetic script of whole parts of Europe in the space of a few centuries. When you zoom out, those flips matter more for modern differences than any tiny mutation creeping along quietly in one valley. And they set the stage for the next part of the story. A Europe tied ever more tightly to its southern shores and its African neighbours, not just by the desert's caravans, but by the sea. The Mediterranean looks small on a globe, just a skinny blue strip between Europe on top and Africa underneath. But for most of human history, that strip wasn't a wall. It was a road. If the Sahara is a breathing barrier, sometimes open, sometimes closed, the Mediterranean is more like a constantly busy harbour. Winds and currents that are predictable enough, coasts never too far apart, islands scattered like stepping stones. For people with boats, it was almost begging to be crossed. By the time farming was spreading through southern Europe, that sea was already knitting together very different shores. Early Neolithic communities along the Levant, Anatolia, the Aegean, and North Africa weren't completely separate experiments. They were watching each other, trading ideas and goods, sometimes moving whole families by boat. Over thousands of years, that becomes a pattern. People from the north coast and south coast meeting, mixing and separating again. Languages change, religions shift, empires rise and fall, but the basic geography keeps pulling populations toward each other. North Africa is right in the middle of that. If you zoom in genetically, North African is not a simple category at all. It's a layered palimpsest, like an old manuscript that's been written on, scraped off, and written on again. Deep underneath there's ancestry tied to very ancient North African foragers, some of it branching off from other African lineages long before recorded history. Over that you see contributions from early Near Eastern farmers moving westward along the coast. Then later waves from sub-Saharan Africa during greener Saharan phases. Then Mediterranean inputs from Europe and the Levant. And then more back and forth again. You can still see those layers in modern DNA. Berber-speaking communities in the Maghreb, for example, often show a strong component of that old North African ancestry, plus clear signals of both Eurasian and sub-Saharan inputs. Coastal cities, especially those that were major ports, usually show even more mixing echoes of Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Vandals, Arabs, Andalusi refugees, Ottoman soldiers, European colonists. It's not one neat block of African that suddenly abuts a neat block of European at the water's edge. It's gradients, overlapping clines, a constant exchange zone. You can see this most clearly in periods where we have both texts and bones. Take the Roman era. By the 1st century CE, the Mediterranean was basically a Roman lake. Roman law, Roman tax collectors, Roman merchants, and hundreds of thousands of people moving back and forth under Roman banners, but with every ancestry you can think of. North Africa was not some marginal frontier, it was a core region. Cities like Carthage, Leptis Magna, and Alexandria weren't just local hubs. They were plugged into an empire-wide network of roads and sea lanes. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Olive oil from modern Tunisia and Algeria filled amphorae that show up in shipwrecks all over the Mediterranean and as far away as Britain. The people who made that system work, soldiers, sailors, slaves, traders, administrators, did not stay put. Legions raised in one province might be stationed in another for decades. Units recruited in North Africa could end up along the Rhine or the Danube. Veterans settled with land grants in new regions. Merchants from the Levant set up shop in Spanish ports. Captives from Gaul or the Balkans were sold into households in coastal Libya or Egypt. Intermarriage followed. Ancient DNA from Roman period cemeteries in places like Rome itself shows this clearly. Some individuals look genetically like local Italian farmers. Others carry profiles more typical of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, or North Africa. A few look like they have sub-Saharan African ancestry, in one city all buried within a couple of generations. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is gene flow in action. Traits that had become more common in one region because of drift, selection, or older migrations don't stay neatly confined. They're carried by people who move, marry, and have children in new places. Over time, sharp differences blur. The story doesn't stop with Rome. When the Western Empire fragments, the network shifts but the sea remains busy. From the 7th century onward, Islamic expansion ties North Africa, the Middle East, parts of Europe, and even Central Asia into a new kind of shared world. Again, North Africa is a crossroads. Arab-speaking and Berber-speaking groups spread across the Maghreb. Some cross into Iberia, creating Al-Andalus. Others push deeper into the Sahara, linking Mediterranean ports to sub-Saharan kingdoms through caravan routes. Meanwhile, cities like Kairouan, Fez, and later Tunis become intellectual and commercial centres. Scholars, jurists, Sufi mystics, translators, artisans and traders circulate between Cordoba, Cairo, Damascus and the Maghreb. People from Iberia settle in North Africa. Later, after the fall of Granada, large numbers of Muslims and Jews are expelled from Spain and Portugal and resettle along the North African coast. Their descendants are still there. Sub-Saharan Africans arrive north of the desert, both as merchants and as captives. Some are assimilated into urban populations. Others become part of dynastic armies or court elites. In the other direction, Arab and Berber groups move south of the Sahara, leaving genetic traces in Sahelian populations today. By this point, trying to draw a hard genetic line between European north of the sea and African, south of it gets very artificial. The same extended families might have branches on both shores. The same genetic variants for things like lactose tolerance, or certain immune responses are flowing back and forth, carried by shepherds, sailors, pilgrims, scribes. Later, European colonialism adds more layers. French, Italian, Spanish, and other settlers move into North Africa. North Africans serve in European armies, travel to European ports, and eventually, in the 19th and 20th centuries, migrate in large numbers to cities like Paris, Marseille, and Barcelona. The transatlantic slave trade, though focused on West and Central Africa, also draws in North African intermediaries and Mediterranean ports, while at the same time pulling millions of Africans to the Americas, where they mix with European and indigenous populations. Some of that new American mixed ancestry later loops back to both Europe and Africa in smaller waves. All of this makes tidy categories break down. When someone asks, what's the difference between European and African evolution? They're often imagining two big, sealed containers slowly diverging over time. One marked Europe, one marked Africa, but the history of the Mediterranean and North Africa doesn't look like that at all. It looks more like a constantly stirred bowl. Locally, you can still have strong patterns. There are regions of Europe with little recent African ancestry, and regions of Africa with little recent European ancestry. There are clear signals of long-term adaptation to particular climates, diets, and disease environments on each continent. But overlaying those local stories is a web of gene flow that has been running for tens of thousands of years, especially through key corridors like the Levant, the Nile Valley, the Strait of Gibraltar, and the central and eastern Mediterranean. The sea that modern maps use to separate continents has, for most of our history, done the opposite. It has carried people across, again and again. So when we compare Europeans and Africans today, we're not looking at two pristine, ancient lineages that diverged cleanly and never met. We're looking at two ends of a network that has always had bridges between them. Those bridges mean that some genetic differences really do reflect long-term local pressures. Sunlight, temperature, pathogens, subsistence strategies, while other differences are simply the result of where particular mixtures ended up being common. Understanding that is the key to the last part of our story, where we turn from the ships and caravans and climate maps back to the question underneath all of this. What exactly are we talking about when we say that different human groups evolved differently? So far, we've mostly talked about the kind of evolution that's easier to picture. You don't get enough sunlight? Skin gets lighter over many generations? You live with malaria? Variants that help you survive become more common. Cold winters, thin air, Strange new grains to digest natural selection working on survival and basic physiology. But there's another kind of evolution quietly running in the background the whole time. Not just who survives, who gets chosen. Biologists call it sexual selection. Imagine two traits. One helps you not die of disease. The other doesn't really affect your survival at all, but it makes you just a bit more likely to find a partner and have children. Natural selection works on the first one. Sexual selection works on the second. In the animal world, this can get spectacular. Peacocks dragging around massive tails that make them easier for predators to catch, but irresistible to peahens. Deer growing huge antlers that are costly to maintain, but useful in male-male competition. Songbirds spending energy on elaborate calls instead of looking for food, because those songs attract mates. In humans, it's murkier. We don't have giant antlers or 8-foot tails. We have stories, ideals, preferences, norms about who is desirable and who is not. And those things change. Still, in principle, the same logic applies. If in a given community people with certain features are consistently more likely to find partners, marry earlier, have more surviving children, or marry up into higher status families, then over long stretches of time those preferences can shift the frequencies of traits, even if the traits themselves don't matter for bare survival. This is where we need to step carefully. It's very tempting to look at modern human groups, notice some visible differences and say, that must be sexual selection. People must have preferred X in Europe and Y in Africa. But history doesn't give us a neat time-lapse of what people actually found attractive 10,000 or 50,000 years ago. We have bones, tools, a few paintings, a handful of written sources from much later. We do not have ancient dating app data. What we can say is this: mate choice never happens in a vacuum. It's shaped by social structure, economics, mobility, and power. Think about marriage patterns in some traditional European farming villages. Marriages were tightly controlled. Parents arranged unions to keep land together, secure alliances, or pay off debts. Status, property, and reputation mattered as much or more than personal attraction. You married who your family could negotiate. In many African societies, you see a huge range of systems. Bride wealth or bride price in some, where cattle or other valuables flow between families. Dowries in others, polygyny in some settings where high-status men have multiple wives, and other men may struggle to marry at all. In some hunter-gatherer groups, relatively free partner choice with more fluid residence patterns. Each of those structures filters who gets to reproduce, and with whom. If high-status lineages in a polygynous society have more children than low-status lineages, and if certain traits, physical or behavioral, are clustered in those high-status families, then over generations those traits can become more common. But what counts as high status is not fixed. It can be land ownership, cattle, warrior reputation, religious authority, literacy, urban wealth, skill as a hunter, talent as a healer. And the traits associated with those roles might be height, might be scar patterns, might be body robustness, might be a particular hairstyle or way of speaking. Some of those are genetic, many are not. On top of that, mobility matters. In a small, isolated community where most people grow up, marry and die within a few miles, local standards of beauty and desirability can become very strong and very specific. In a trading hub or imperial city, people from many regions meet and mix. Preferences themselves are mixed. New fashions appear. Old markers of in-group and out-group change. Ancient port cities on the Mediterranean, caravan towns south of the Sahara, riverine hubs along the Niger or the Danube. All of these would have been places where different ideas of attractiveness collided and blended. And these ideas are not simply European versus African. Within Europe, preferences have shifted repeatedly across time and place. Pale skin versus tanned skin, plumpness versus thinness, elaborate hairstyles versus covered hair, different ideals of masculine and feminine build and behavior. Within Africa, the variation is even broader. Pastoralist groups with long histories of valuing tall, lean builds, farming groups where sturdiness and the ability to work fields might be prized, societies where decorative scarification is a mark of beauty and adulthood, others where unmarked skin is preferred, norms around body size, hair, adornment, and gendered appearance that can vary dramatically over a few hundred miles. Trying to reduce all of that to Africans prefer X, Europeans prefer Y, simply doesn't fit the evidence. Even when we zoom in on more specific questions, like facial features, hair texture, or body proportions, we run into the same problem. Yes, people everywhere notice these things, they talk about them. They make art about them. They build myths and stories around them. But the line between a trait people like and a trait that has actually been driven to higher frequency by sexual selection over many millennia is very hard to draw. Geneticists can sometimes detect signals of strong selection around certain genes, regions of the genome where variation has been swept away quickly. We see this clearly for things like lactose digestion, malaria resistance, or altitude adaptation. For traits more tied to appearance, especially those involving many genes with small effects, the picture is much fuzzier. The same variant might influence several things at once. It might hitchhike along with a neighbouring region under selection for a completely different reason. It might be shaped by chance, so when someone confidently declares Group A evolved trait T because their ancestors found it sexy, that's usually storytelling, not science. Could sexual selection have played some role in shaping differences we see today between populations in Europe, Africa, and elsewhere? Yes, anywhere humans choose partners. It's operating alongside survival selection, cultural rules, and random drift. Preferences can amplify or dampen local trends. If, in a given environment, people happen to find trait T appealing, and that trait is also slightly beneficial for survival, the combination of natural and sexual selection might spread it faster. If a trait is mildly costly in survival terms but strongly favoured in mate choice, it might still hang on or even flourish, as long as the costs aren't too high. But we should hold this idea lightly. There is no single timeless African standard of beauty and no single timeless European one. There are hundreds of overlapping changing cultures, each with its own aesthetics keyed to its own history, economy, and beliefs. And those cultures have been in contact, influencing each other, for a very long time. That makes it extremely difficult to point to any particular visible difference between modern populations and say, this is sexual selection, and that over there is climate, as if we could assign neat percentages. More honest is to say human evolution is a tangle. Climate, diet, pathogens, social hierarchy, war, migration, random chance, and yes, mate choice all braided together. We can sometimes tease out particular strands, especially when the genetics line up cleanly with a known environmental pressure. But for many traits, especially ones loaded with cultural meaning, the scientific answer is still, we don't really know, and we should be cautious. That caution becomes especially important in the final part of our story. Because once people start talking about sexual selection and visible differences, it's a short slide into old racial myths, myths that claim to explain who is naturally smarter, stronger, more beautiful, or more civilized. To understand why those claims don't hold up, we need to step back from individual traits and look at what genetics can actually tell us about human variation and what it absolutely cannot. If you zoom out far enough, human genetics doesn't look like a set of boxes. It looks like a map of gradients. Geneticists call these gradients clines. Instead of sharp jumps between types of humans, you see slow shifts in the frequencies of different variants as you move across space. Walk on foot from Senegal to Sudan, or from Portugal to China, and every village you pass will be, on average, a little different from the last. Skin tones darken or lighten gradually. Face shapes, hair textures, body builds, they blend and blur. You only get sharp boundaries when you draw them yourself. That's what race in the modern sense mostly is. Lines that societies drew on top of a biological pattern that is fundamentally continuous. When scientists first started sampling DNA from around the world, they were looking to answer a very simple question. How different are we really? The answer surprised a lot of people. Most genetic variation in humans is shared. Pick two people from different continents, and odds are that for most of their genome, they'll both have fairly common, widely distributed variants. Pick two people from the same village, and you'll often find just as much genetic difference between them as between people labelled as different races. When you crunch the numbers, only a modest slice of total human genetic diversity separates broad geographic regions. The majority, often quoted as around 80 to 90%, depending on how you measure it, is found within local populations, not between them. In other words, if you lined up all the genetic differences that exist in our species, only a relatively small portion would help you guess where someone's distant ancestors came from, and an even smaller portion would line up neatly with the racial categories used in, say, a census form. So why does race look so obvious to us? Because our brains love patterns, and they love visible traits. Skin colour, hair form, eye shape, nose shape, a few prominent features controlled by a relatively small number of genes, can vary quite starkly between people whose ancestors adapted to different environments. Our minds grab those features and build stories around them. But here's the trap. Those few visible traits are not a reliable guide to overall relatedness. Two people with very different skin tones can be more closely related in terms of overall ancestry than two people whose skin looks almost identical. Populations in East Africa and southern India, for example, can share similar complexions, but have very different deeper histories. Some groups in North Africa may be lighter skinned than some groups further south, but carry substantial ancestry from sub-Saharan lineages. The genes that shape melanin production or hair curl or eye fold are tiny slices of the genome. They can be pushed around quickly by strong local selection, UV radiation, climate, diet, without dragging the rest of the genome with them. They're like little flags flapping in the wind while the mountains underneath barely move. If you only look at the flags, you can convince yourself there are clear, fixed types of humans. Look at the mountains, the full genomic landscape, and the boundaries blur. This is where many old myths about pure populations collapse. There are no large human groups that have been genetically sealed off from everyone else since the dawn of time. Our species' history is one of movement and mixing. Hunter-gatherer bands trading and intermarrying. Pastoralists moving with herds, linking distant regions. Farmers expanding into new lands and absorbing or displacing older populations. Empires rising and falling, armies marching, merchants sailing, captives taken, migrants invited. Europe has been reshaped repeatedly by waves from the Near East, the Steppe, North Africa, and within itself. Africa has seen Sahara crossings, Indian Ocean routes, Nile corridors, and deep ancient mixing among its own many regions. If you go back a few thousand years, the idea of a pure anything, pure European, pure African, pure anything is a fantasy. Everyone is the product of many lineages converging. Another persistent myth is that each race has some fixed inner essence, a natural character, a built-in destiny. One group is naturally rational, another naturally emotional. One hard-working, another lazy. One born to rule, another born to serve. From a genetic point of view, this doesn't make sense. Genes influence traits, but most traits we care about, intelligence, personality, musical talent, athleticism, are shaped by thousands of variants, each with tiny effects, interacting with environment, culture, education, nutrition, stress, and chance. You can't point to a gene or even a small set of genes and say, this is the European essence, or this is what makes Africans like X. The variation within any large group is simply too big. For almost any ability you choose, the distribution of that ability in one population overlaps heavily with the distribution in another. Yes, there are genetic differences between populations. We've been talking about them all along. Skin pigmentation, malaria resistance, lactase persistence, altitude tolerance, immune system variants tuned to local disease ecologies. Those differences are real, and in some cases medically important. But they do not map cleanly onto folk racial categories, and they do not sort people into neat stacks of worth or potential. That hasn't stopped people from trying. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, some scientists built elaborate racial hierarchies, measuring skulls, noses, and brain weights, convinced they were capturing innate superiority and inferiority. Today, most of that has been thoroughly discredited. The measurements were biased, the samples cherry-picked, the interpretations soaked in the politics and prejudices of their time. Yet newer versions of the same idea keep resurfacing, that your ancestry locks in your abilities, that genes dictate destiny, that whole populations are biologically fated to certain roles. Genetics does not support that. What it does say is something quieter and less flattering to our urge to rank people. Human populations carry different portfolios of genetic variants because they have different histories of adaptation, migration, and drift. Those portfolios matter for things like how your body processes certain foods, how you respond to particular pathogens, how your skin handles sunlight, how your red blood cells cope with oxygen at altitude. They also influence a vast array of subtle traits in ways we're only beginning to understand, often with no obvious connection to value or ability. But genes operate in context. The same genetic variant can have very different outcomes depending on environment, nutrition, exposure to toxins, childhood stress, access to healthcare, education, social expectations. When we see differences in average outcomes between groups today, health disparities, income gaps, test scores, those are overwhelmingly shaped by these social and environmental factors, not by deep, immutable genetic divides. Respectful framing starts here. Differences between populations are records of journeys. They're traces of climates survived, diseases endured, crops domesticated, rivers crossed, deserts navigated, empires risen and fallen. They are about adaptation and history, not about who is more human, or more valuable, or more capable in some cosmic sense. Every living population today descends from ancestors who were clever and resilient enough to get through ice ages, droughts, plagues, wars and famines. Every lineage carries strengths, innovations and hard-won survivals. The story genetics tells is not a ladder with advanced people at the top. It's a branching, looping web of families facing different challenges in different places at different times and finding different solutions. Europeans and Africans did not evolve so differently because one group sprinted ahead and another fell behind. They evolved differently because their ancestors walked through different landscapes, met different hazards, adopted different ways of life, and kept meeting, mixing and moving all along the way. To see the real reason, we have to put the boxes down and follow those paths. So let's bring all of this back together. When people ask, why did Europeans and Africans evolve so differently? They're usually looking for one big cause, one clean explanation. But there isn't just one. There's a whole stack of pressures layered on top of each other, playing out over tens of thousands of years. Start with the environment. Sunlight, temperature, rainfall, altitude. In much of Africa, strong ultraviolet radiation punished unprotected skin, and folate, a fragile vitamin crucial for healthy pregnancies, had to be shielded. Dark, melanin-rich skin was the winning strategy there. In much of Europe, weaker UV and long winters turned the equation upside down. Suddenly, letting light in to make vitamin D mattered more, especially when diets were low in that nutrient. Lighter skin became advantageous in those contexts. Climate pulled in other directions too. Hot, humid tropics selected for bodies that could shed heat. Longer limbs, leaner builds, efficient cooling. Cold, seasonal climates favoured compact bodies, shorter limbs, and in some cases more body fat, shapes that held on to precious warmth. Move from the equator toward the poles, and you can see those trends, not as hard rules, but as broad tendencies written into averages. Then layer on disease, different regions, different microbial worlds. In many African environments, malaria became one of the most brutal forces of natural selection on Earth. Variants like sickle cell, G6PD deficiency, and others rose because they offered some protection, despite their costs. In Europe, malaria mattered in some areas, but other diseases took centre stage. Waves of plague, smallpox, crowd-borne infections that flourished once dense towns and cities appeared. Over time, immune systems in those populations were tuned by different epidemics, leaving different genetic fingerprints. Add diet. Before farming, people along African coasts and rivers leaned on fish, shellfish, and diverse wild plants. Inland foragers found their own mosaics of roots, tubers, fruits, and game. Later, pastoralism and mixed farming emerged in multiple places on the continent, each with its own staples: sorghum, yams, millet, cattle, goats. In Europe, farming arrived with a heavy emphasis on cereals like wheat and barley, plus dairy in many regions. That created intense selection for traits like lactase persistence in some populations, and for ways of handling high-grain diets. Different foods, different shortages, different solutions. Demography matters too. Who moves, who stays, who has children, who doesn't. Small groups splitting from larger ones, founding new populations with only a slice of the original genetic diversity. Rapid expansions after new technologies appear. Farming, herding, metalwork, diluting or replacing older lineages. Bottlenecks, plagues, migrations from neighbouring regions, all reshuffling the deck over and over again. And through it all, gene flow. People aren't static. They travel, trade, raid, marry across boundaries. North Africa, trading with Europe and the Near East for thousands of years. Saharan routes linking West Africa, the Sahel and the Mediterranean. Steppe pastoralists moving into Europe, Indian Ocean networks tying East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India. Every one of those routes carries people, and every person carries genes. So instead of two isolated branches, Europe and Africa, think of overlapping circles, pushing, pulling, and blending at their edges. This is why it's misleading to talk about Europeans and Africans as if they were single, fixed entities. There is no one European history. There is no one African history. There are Basques and Greeks, Sami and Sicilians, Irish and Poles, each shaped by different mixes of hunter-gatherers, farmers, steppe herders, and later movements. There are Hausa and Xhosa, Amazigh and Oromo, Yoruba and Afar, Nilotic herders and coastal Swahili, rainforest foragers and desert nomads, each carrying distinct local adaptations and deep region-specific stories. Many histories, many ecologies, many experiments in being human. The patterns we see today, skin tones, body builds, disease resistances, metabolic quirks, are not scorecards. They're travelogues. They tell us where people's ancestors lived, what they ate, what illnesses they faced, how crowded their worlds were, how often they mixed with neighbours. They do not tell us who is more evolved, more advanced, or naturally suited for some role in a modern society. Evolution doesn't care about our hierarchies. It cares about survival and reproduction under local conditions. From that perspective, every living population is equally successful. Their ancestors all made it through the gauntlet. As genetic tools improve, our picture will keep changing. New ancient DNA will redraw migration maps. Hidden episodes of mixing will come to light. Traits we thought we understood will turn out to have more complicated origins. And some of the categories we used to, European, African, even modern human, may look fuzzier and more fluid than ever. If you've made it this far, drifting towards sleep or listening in the background while you rest, you're part of that ongoing story too. Your genome is a mosaic of old journeys and ancient adaptations braided together in a way that is unique to you. If you found this relaxing or interesting, it really helps the channel if you gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more sleepy deep dives into history and science. If you're still awake, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Are you winding down for the night, halfway through your day, or up too late again? And if you'd like to support this project in the best way, the most helpful thing you can do is listen on Spotify. The link is down in the description. However you're here, and wherever you're listening from, thank you for sharing this little stretch of the human story. Rest well.